Chapter 495. In the dim, smoke-shrouded corridor of the building, the members of Group 7 shook hands with the Westwood Special Forces team and said goodbye, but they did not really separate. Although Bai Yulan had the special document issued by the Zhong family's old house in her hands, she couldn't just leave after such a violent round of gunfire in the city's rioting district. She needed to wait for Celine's confirmation. The commander of the Westwood Special Forces team looked at the members of Group 7 beside him and could not help but shake his head to dispel the shock in his heart. He walked to the side of the military vehicle and reported the specific details to the higher-ups in the vehicle. The commander of the Westwood Special Forces team, Colonel Lake, sat in the vehicle expressionlessly, but when he heard the two names Su Lu and Group 7, he frowned earlier. Su Lu, who was wearing a military uniform without epaulets, walked into the restaurant at the intersection under the red light of dusk. The restaurant was already bustling with activity. Countless soup pots were boiling with the spicy and exciting smell of life. However, when he glanced around, his gaze fell on a small square table on his right that was slanted to the side of the square window. A middle-aged man in a plain white shirt was sitting at the small table. A dark military uniform was draped over the back of the chair behind him. From the creases of the uniform, he could faintly see stars hidden in them. Even in the square where hundreds of thousands of people gathered, Sulu would probably see him at first glance and find it hard to look away. The feeling was different from when he saw Du Xiaoqing at the base a year ago. The middle-aged man who was immersed in eating at the small table did not give off the feeling of standing proudly in a chaotic world. He was just silent and ordinary, but his pair of white eyebrows, like a sleeping tiger, gave people the feeling that if he raised them, countless people around him would bleed. There were a few tables below the small table by the window, and all of them were military officers of the Westwoods. Their expressions were calm and silent, and they seemed to be eating normally. Only the occasional fierce and vigilant light in their eyes could let people with sharp eyes notice that they were about to use their lives to protect the middle-aged man at the small table at any time. The middle-aged man did not raise his head. His beautiful eyebrows were still, but he naturally exuded a strong sense of oppression. This was probably the aura that had been tempered through years of monstrous power and unparalleled dignity. Sulu was invited over by phone. He knew who this person was, so he wasn't surprised. However, he was still a little shocked. He secretly assessed that this person was probably the strongest man in the entire Federation other than the war god. But at this time, most of his thoughts were on the two Bermuda experts and the team members who were carrying out the mission, so he didn't have much opportunity to feel anything. Just as he took the first step toward the window, a burst of intense gunshots and explosions suddenly sounded above the restaurant. His footsteps came to an abrupt halt as he looked through the glass toward the source of the sound. Many of the alarmed customers in the restaurant couldn't see that in the middle of an ordinary building about 2 kilometers away, countless gorgeous gunfire suddenly spewed out. Countless smoke and flames broke the glass and spewed out like the tail flames of a fighter jet, surging into the clean evening sky of the Westwoods. The loud explosions could still be heard so clearly in the restaurant. It could be imagined how violent and terrifying the gunfight in the building was. Su Li's eyesight was excellent. He could even see that outside the window of the 13th floor of the building, countless bullets were like black dots shuttling back and forth. In the end, their sharpness was worn down by the evil gravitational force. After losing their speed, they turned into countless metal raindrops and fell to the street, hitting the roofs of cars and buildings. The Westwoods had the most soldiers and ammunition, but social security had always been good. Such a fierce gunfight in the downtown area was a shocking scene that had not been seen for many years. The diners in the restaurant were terrified. They paid their bills and left. At this time, in a room near the kitchen at the back of the restaurant, a burst of rapid and crisp gunshots rang out. This burst of gunshots was very close and very real. The diners' faces turned pale as they screamed and rushed out. When the gunshots rang out, the Westwoods officers surrounding the window suddenly trembled and quickly grasped their respective guns. Sulu knew that Lan Xiaolong's men had also made a move. His heart suddenly contracted and his body tensed up. The middle-aged man at the small table by the window didn't seem to hear or see any gunfire. His right hand holding the soup spoon didn't tremble at all. He steadily scooped up a spoonful of bright red chili oil soup and gently poured it on the white rice in the black wooden bowl. Sulu lowered his eyes slightly and took 2 deep breaths to force himself to calm down. He walked toward the small table. The Westwoods officers didn't stop him. Instead, they made a path for him. Sulu stood by the small table and looked at the middle-aged man who was mixing rice with his head down. He could only see the man's thick eyebrows mixed with silver hair. This posture didn't give Sulu any feeling of looking down on him. Instead, he felt that the man was sitting on a barren mountain high and far away. The middle-aged man still didn't look up. He carefully mixed the white rice in the black wooden bowl into a bright red stew. He put down the silver spoon, picked up the long chopsticks, and accurately picked up a piece of rat meat from the red chili oil soup and placed it on the rice. He then picked up the rice bowl and began to eat quickly. At the same time he mumbled one word. Sit. Sulu pulled out a chair and sat down. Eat. A West Woods officer wearing a colonel epaulette set a set of cutlery in front of Sulu and quickly brought over a bowl of white rice. Sulu was only a lieutenant colonel. He immediately stood up and saluted to express his gratitude. Then he sat down again. He didn't say anything and didn't hesitate at all. He picked up the bowl and chopsticks and began to eat the white rice with the red soup as if he wanted to compete with the middle-aged man across the table in speed. That in a very short time, the two people at the small table had finished 4 bowls of white rice. The middle-aged man in an ordinary white shirt finally put down the long chopsticks in his hand. He took a wet towel from the colonel beside him, unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, and vigorously wiped the sweat from his forehead due to the spicy food. A soldier has to be able to eat. The middle-aged man raised his head and looked at Sulu. If the stomach is strong enough, you won't get gastritis no matter how fast you eat. If you always have to remember that you have to be as beautiful as a plum blossom, then you shouldn't eat for the rest of your life. Because if you eat, you'll always shit. Sulu wasn't sure if these words were directed at teacher Xiaoqing of the Sonic Federation. He didn't know how to respond, so he could only smile slightly and remain silent. Those subordinates of yours aren't bad. The middle-aged man glanced at the building in the twilight out of the corner of his eye. He looked at the pitch-black marks of the violent surprise attack and said with a carefree smile, I like people who do things simply and directly. Group 7 had launched a violent attack in the downtown area of the West Woods Sunset Province according to his own arrangements. Sulu had been worried whether or not the West Woods would have any opinions. At this moment, when he heard the other party actually express a hint of admiration, he couldn't help but feel slightly surprised. He replied very seriously, Thank you for the praise, Commander. Hearing the word Commander, Zhong Suahu, who had just returned to the rear from the frontline 3320 Fallen Star, was silent for a moment. This Commander-in-Chief of the Federation, who controlled the military and political power of the entire West Woods region, turned his head with a slightly complicated expression. Through the transparent glass of the restaurant, he looked at the green trees by the street, as well as the silhouette of the city beyond the treetops even further away. This was his city, his planet, his region. Zhong Suahu's flowery eyebrows raised slightly. There was an undisguised sense of coldness and dominance in his eyes. He didn't look at Sulu as he said in a deep voice, I'm going to start arresting people. Is there anyone you want to arrest? It was the madam's sister who had arranged to have a meal with this big shot in the restaurant. At this time, Sulu still didn't know that apart from the attempt on his life, there was also an attempt on Zhong Suahu's life. So for a moment he didn't understand why the other party's tone was so gloomy. In the Westwoods region, there were many people involved in this assassination, and most of them were employees of the government system or even the military. Su Li's temperament was cheerful and determined, but he was definitely not Mr. Nice Guy. If someone knocked out his teeth, he would only stuff them into the other party's stomach. He was risking his life on the front lines to kill the enemy, but there were people in the Federation who were cold-bloodedly trying to kill him. How could he let them go? It was just that this matter was indeed a little tricky to deal with. He had originally planned to let Group 7 do the dirty work behind the scenes, returning darkness and cold-bloodedness to darkness and cold-bloodedness. Group 7's subordinates, these experts in darkness, did have this kind of ability, but to let Group 7 participate in the battle against the aristocratic families because of him with no future was really something he didn't want to see. No matter how strong the members' individual combat abilities were, they were still just ordinary people. Group 7 was just a normal combat team from the Shell Motor Company, and this was the Federation that was full of power, order, and dark fog. I have a lot of people I want to arrest. Sulu quickly made a decision. He looked seriously at Zhong Suahu across the table. He didn't think about whether the other party was talking about arrest or assassination. Because no matter which, it was a form of revenge that he could accept. Most importantly, as long as the person this middle-aged man wanted to arrest was in the Westwoods region, no one would be able to escape. Because he was the number one person in the Westwoods. He passed the electronic notebook that he had already sorted out to the other side of the table. Zhong Suahu opened the electronic notebook and silently looked at it for a long time. A slight mocking smile gradually appeared at the corner of his mouth. He said, The old man really spared no effort to train you? There were a lot of people in the electronic notebook, which was information that the Westwood's military intelligence department didn't know. Looking at the call records and evidence, Zhong Suahu was very clear that other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no one could get hold of such top-secret information. Since the attitude of the lady behind Macho's back mountain was to watch silently, then other than the war god of Philadelphia, who could persuade the Bureau of Proclamation to intervene in this murder plan against a lieutenant colonel? Sula didn't explain anything because he would never be able to explain the strange connection between himself and the glory of the charter. Arrest all of them. Zhong Suahu threw the electronic notebook to the colonel next to him and said indifferently, "If anyone dares to run, kill them all." Sulu lowered his head in silence for a moment, then suddenly looked up and asked seriously, "What about your nephew?" Chapter 496. After serious consideration, Sulu finally realized that no matter how hard he considered it, he still could not forcibly suppress that thought. That was why he bravely said these words. However, Commander Zhong did not answer this question as if he did not hear it at all. His pair of crouching tiger eyebrows were as calm as ever. He waved his hand and summoned a bottle of wine as clear as water, pouring it into the cups of both parties. Zhong Sugu raised his cup and drank it all in one gulp. The wine as clear as water was actually as spicy as a knife. When it entered his throat, it turned into a line of fire, cutting wounds all over his body. He frowned, enjoying this feeling of pain and pleasure. Taking a deep breath, he said hoarsely, "Don't be obsessed with who wants to kill you. The key is whether or not you are still alive." It was not clear if this sentence was a certain answer, but Sulu understood. He silently raised the cup of wine, stared at it for a moment and slowly sipped. He only felt that it was extremely bitter and unbearable. When my father was alive, no one in the Federation dared to touch me because he was alive. If I were to die, he would definitely be furious. His fury would burn on the land of the Federation. Not many people would be able to withstand it. Zhong Sugu continued indifferently, "Just like if I were alive, no one would dare to touch my daughter. This is the same principle. Right now, many people are trying to kill me because if I were to die right now, no one would have the ability to spread the fury of my soul to every corner of the Federation after my death." Zhong Sugu put down the wine cup, raised his chin slightly and said, "But I once weighed my head with my own hands. It was only 7.5 kilograms. The people of the Empire are the same as us, so our heads are only 7.5 kilograms. I really want to see if there is anyone in this universe who can chop off my 7.5 kilograms. Sulu listened quietly. He roughly understood what the big shot before him wanted to say, but the silence did not last long. He could not help but frown and say, "In the Wood Valley, there seems to have been a problem. In the Wood Valley Manor in the southern suburbs of the capital, there had once been an assassination attempt on Zhong Huoyen's little friend." Commander Zhong narrowed his eyes slightly, picked up the glass of liquor and drank it in one gulp. He didn't say anything but a smile appeared on his lips. However, this smile was so cold in the eyes of others. The streets outside the restaurant were quiet and empty. The sky had long been immersed in the color of blue-black ink. At this moment, countless loud noises suddenly came from the direction of the Victory Square of the Sunset State. Beautiful fireworks soared into the sky and bloomed in the night sky like gorgeous flowers. In the Westwood Sunset State, in order to celebrate the victory of a battle at the front line, they generously set off fireworks according to the historical custom of many years. However, under the background of the fireworks that lit up the night sky, not many people noticed the sporadic sounds of gunshots. Amidst these sounds, the sharp sirens that pierced through the streets of the Sunset State capital became somewhat lonely. Following these sharp sirens, countless military vehicles poured out of the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters of the Federation's Westwoods Military Police Headquarters, the Legal Department Building and the Garrison Division camped directly under the command of the headquarters. All of these military vehicles were filled with armed Westwood soldiers. Thousands of Westwood soldiers, divided into countless teams, poured into the Changfeng military base, forcibly entered the underground space of a warehouse in the suburbs, entered the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters of the Federation Investigation Bureau, and completely controlled the Venus Hotel of the Ministry of Defense. In just half an hour, countless units fell under the absolute control of the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters. As time passed, government officials and military officers were taken away from various buildings from time to time because they were involved in a top-secret investigation that had not yet been made public. They were no longer as calm as they used to be. Their hands were tightly tied behind their backs, and their expressions were bleak. Under the tight watch of the Westwood soldiers, they awkwardly got into military vehicles and were arrested in the dark of the Westwoods military prison. This was a brazen purge launched by the Westwoods Tigers. From the Westwoods Liaison Office of the President's Office to the Westwoods Office of the Ministry of Defense, and then to the Westwoods General Office of the Federation Investigation Bureau. Countless government agencies under the political structure of the Federation were all sternly purged by the Westwoods soldiers. Any government officials and military officers who were suspected of being involved in certain matters, were all knocked to the ground and would not be able to rise again. Zhong Suahu silently looked out of the window and watched the military vehicles whizzing by on the streets. His face was expressionless. He did not care about the angry reaction of the political community of the capital ring, the stern reprimand of President Pabre, the meaningful persuasion of the big shots in the military, and the media reports and the reaction of the so-called people, because he was the real master of this space zone. The moment you walked in, there were also people who wanted to kill me. Have you ever considered the possibility that the two specialists who came to Bermuda on the surface wanted to kill you, but perhaps their real target was me? Zhong Suahu picked up the wine glass. His wrist slightly paused, and his left hand threw a peanut into his mouth and gently chewed as he said with a smile. Sulu was stunned. He began to quickly think about the murder incident that started a few months ago in his mind. He found that there was indeed not much evidence to prove that Commander Zhong's opinion was absurd. Maybe it's just a joke. Zhong Suahu picked up some vegetables with his chopsticks and pressed them into the boiling red soup. He calmly said, "There are many people in the Federation who want me dead. You know very well that I just need an excuse. However, the list you gave me did surprise me a little. It was your contribution that all the rats on this planet were dug out." Sulu was speechless. He could only shrug like Lan Xiaolong. His eyes fell on the delicate rat meat in the pot of red oil and felt a little strange. At this time, Colonel Lake, who was in charge of the purge operation in the Sunset Province, walked into the restaurant. He came to Zhong Suahu's side and quickly reported the specific results of the operation tonight. Then he gave a standard military salute and walked out of the door to continue the operation that was bound to last for the whole night. During this process, Colonel Lake did not look at Sulu because Sulu kept his head down. Because when he walked into the restaurant, Sulu, who had a good memory, immediately remembered that day many years ago in Donglin. Those were the experiences, the fists, and the violence that he would never forget in his life. Therefore, he lowered his head and drank silently. Colonel Lake walked out of the restaurant and suddenly stopped under the shadow of the intersection of the street lights and trees. He frowned slightly. He felt that the young man who was eating with the commander was somewhat familiar, and it should be an unforgettable memory in his life. "Who is that person? I don't see his epaulets," he asked the subordinate beside him. Zhou Jin, who was carrying a Qian machine gun, glanced at the French window of the restaurant and replied, "It's Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu." "That's Su Lu?" Lake asked with a serious expression. "Yes. Back then he was a squatting soldier in Donglin. He even took the ancient bell back to S1. Zhou Jin shrugged and told the story of the past with a trace of emotion. He said, "It was that relationship. He seemed to have a very close relationship with Mississippi. I heard that he even went to Shisha State once." Colonel Lake was deep in thought. He slowly put on his sunglasses and remained silent. Chapter 497. The red pot was still boiling on the small table next to the glass window. The smooth meat and fresh vegetables were mixed with red oil. Together with a few random side dishes, it was the best dish to go with the wine. A bottle of high-quality wine didn't take long before it was swallowed by Zhong Shouhu and Su Lu. The two of them didn't drink in a heroic manner. They didn't have the awe-inspiring aura of a whale swallowing the sea, but they drank one cup after another. They slowly sipped and kept turning their wrists, and their speed was extremely fast. Zhong Shouhu picked up a wet towel and wiped off the sweat on his face and neck. He unbuttoned 3 buttons on his normal white shirt, but he still seemed to feel that the air was a little stuffy. He raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at the colonel beside him. He then looked at the glass window next to the table and the shade of the trees on the street outside the window. He said, "I want to get some air." The colonel saluted him and waved his hand to summon a few soldiers. They walked out of the restaurant and took out all kinds of tools. Without hesitation, they quickly and neatly removed the entire glass window. The night breeze blew gently on the floor around the stove, and it was slightly wet. Su Lu, who was taking off his military uniform, felt his fingers stiffen. He felt the cool air rushing in and couldn't help but be stunned and speechless. For some reason, deep in his heart, he thought of the arrogant back when he got off the train halfway through the Shanglin Mountain on the Shugong High-Speed Railway 2 years ago. Much better. Zhong Shouhu sighed softly and lifted the collar of his shirt to fan the night breeze that kept coming in. Seeing the emotion between Su Li's eyebrows that he didn't try to hide, he smiled slightly and said mockingly, "I've been eating in this restaurant for decades. Of course, I won't let the boss lose money. Little guy, are you going to show your cute sense of justice even for such a small thing?" Sulu picked up the wine in his cup and drank it all. He grimaced slightly because of the spiciness, and then shrugged to show that he didn't comment. Over the years, he had seen too many privileges appear in the Federation. He wasn't numb yet, but he wasn't surprised either. In the eyes of many people in the Federation, I'm the darkest and most arrogant warlord. I'm the local tyrant of the West Woods who actually took over the Federation and damaged the authority of the government. Zhong Shouhu looked at him expressionlessly and said, "My Zhong family has defended the western border for the Federation for thousands of years, but in the end, we will be cursed for thousands of years. Since I have to bear the infamy, why shouldn't I enjoy the feeling of power? If the Federation wants to station an official, they need my approval. If the Department of Defense wants to draft a battle plan, they need to discuss it with me. I am the emperor of this galaxy. I am the savior of the people of the West Woods." Sulu understood why this mature big shot sitting across the table would say such self-evaluation in front of him, which went beyond arrogance and bordered on arrogance and stupidity. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that everyone in the hotel, including the professional soldiers from the West Woods who had been protecting him, had already left, leaving only the two of them. Based on the firm beliefs of more than 20 years, he quickly retorted subconsciously, "There has never been a savior, nor an immortal emperor." That's right. The Federation has already been free of the imperial system for tens of thousands of years. Zhong Shouhu looked at him with a slightly emotional expression and said with slight mockery, "But everyone knows that the emperor has never disappeared. They just changed a few clothes." George Carlin, the transcript of the conversation after the tea party at the beginning of autumn. Sulu raised his head and said the source of this famous quote. He had a strange feeling in his heart. He felt that Commander Zhong's words were not referring to himself, but to something else. "I heard that you used to be a squatter in Donglin?" Zhong Shouhu looked at him and said with a smile, "If that's the case, you do have some fate with the Zhong family." The real big shots of the Federation seem to be very good at this kind of method of abruptly changing the focus of the conversation to control the atmosphere of the venue. In the few conversations that Sulu had with the madam in the back of the mountain, he had deeply experienced this kind of headache-inducing communication method, so he did not feel too uncomfortable. He calmly replied, 2 years of maintenance of the mine, what fate? Donglin? Is that replica of the ancient clock still hanging on Bell Tower Street? Zhong Shouhu drank another cup of wine. The liquid, as hot as fire and as pure as water, entered his body and actually turned into a kind of reminiscence and a very distant heaviness. Hearing the words Bell Tower Street, Su Li's heart shrank slightly. He stared blankly at the other for a moment and realized that the middle-aged man was only reminiscing about the past and did not seem to be grasping onto his most secret past. He said somewhat hesitantly, "I heard that it's been put in a museum." Yes, after so many years, it can only become a pile of trash in a dark corner of a museum. In this Federation, how many people still remember what happened back then? Zhong Shouhu's eyes lowered slightly and said, "Back then the 4th Military Region was sent to Donglin to develop a mining planet. The command ship crashed into the main planet of Donglin and turned into a sky full of fireworks. Unfortunately, the ancient clock carried by the commander of the 4th Military Region was not destroyed." When Sulu heard this, he thought of the E-clock in front of the square in front of the Zhong family's old house at number 36 Way 2 District. He thought of the ancient story of Bell Tower Street where he had lived since he was a child. His body could not help but stiffen slightly. He thought of something and understood something. He could not help but feel that the world was really too unpredictable. Zhong Shouhu's beautiful eyebrows raised slightly. He drank another cup of wine and said slowly with a hint of biting coldness, "This is a big joke in the history of the Federation. Because according to the investigation of the Federation government later, the Federation government at that time seemed to be called something like the Bullshit United States. They also had a bullshit management committee. They said that the reason the battleship crashed into the ground was because of a simple gravity calculation error that could not be any simpler." He stared into Su Li's eyes with a cold gaze. "Do you think my ancestor would make such a stupid and heartbreaking mistake?" Sulu thought of the main character of this story that he and his orphan companions seemed to often laugh at when he was a child. The commander who left behind a famous quote about fireworks and then left with his tail between his legs. He could not help but feel his lips and tongue become a little dry. But the government thought so, the media thought so, and so did the stupid people who had just broken away from imperial politics and happily threw themselves toward the words like democracy and freedom. Zhong Shouhu said expressionlessly. So the management committee of the Federation took the opportunity to launch a rectification movement within the military. The 4th Military Region was forcibly transferred away from the East Woods district where countless crystal mines had already been discovered and came to the West Woods that was still a piece of uncivilized land at that time. Sulu lowered his head. The chopsticks in his hand were a little stiff and awkward. He guessed what this big shot wanted to say, but in the depths of his heart he could not accept it for a while. The origin of the names of the streets in his hometown that he had known since he was a child was actually the fruit of the Federation's dark politics. What gravity calculation error? It's just a conspiracy that countless people participated in. Zhong Shouhu's emotionless words finally proved his guess. History appeared in front of Sulu in a way that was personally narrated by the descendants of the people involved, but in a completely opposite way. It turned out that the first army to enter the East Woods district was the Zhong family's 4th Military Region. It was also after this incident that the Zhong family was forced to come to the western border of the Federation, and that was how the name of the Zhong family in the West Woods came to be. It turned out that this incident was just a conspiracy of the Federation government. It turned out that the sky was not really blue and the clouds were not always white. The democratic sages who peacefully overthrew the monarchy and enjoyed great fame in history were not so clean. If this continued, could it be that George Card was really an uncle and Lipifu was possibly a woman? Was Schiller really someone in the 5-person team? Were the 2 moons above S1 really the failed products of an alien experiment? Sulu thought so. He was silent for a long time, drinking 3 glasses of wine in a row, and then asked a question that even he himself thought was stupid. What? Perhaps the current head of the Zhong family, Zhong Shouhu, had not had the opportunity to tell these stories that happened countless years ago, to tell the Federation people about the humiliation and conspiracy of the family that was once regarded as a warlord. So when he heard this stupid question, Commander Zhong's answer was very calm. Because the elected government that just won the election and successfully forced His Majesty to step down urgently needs an opportunity to weaken the 7 families. Most importantly, the government needs the support of the former royal family. The Federation Crystal Mine Union is the price for this support. The Federation Crystal Mine Union controlled the most basic lifeline of interstellar travel, and was the core and most crucial giant enterprise of the entire Federation. Sulu lived in the East Woods district. In other words, his family had worked for this giant enterprise for generations. However, until a few years ago he still thought that he was working for the Federation like the people of East Woods, until he met a certain distinguished friend. "It's the Thai family," he answered in a deep voice. The Federation government was able to make the Thai royal family peacefully hand over the power in their hands. I never believed that there was no insider trading. The crystal mines on the East Woods mineral planet that are more precious than gold were undoubtedly part of the deal. Zhong Shouhu said expressionlessly. At that time, East Woods had not yet been fully developed. Our Zhong family was the first to enter, and naturally, we were the ones that had to be sacrificed. Sulu had never had any good feelings about the political circle, but as an orphan born at the bottom of the Federation, he always habitually stood on the side of the elected government, and did not have much good feelings about the 7 families hidden behind history. After a moment of silence, he said somewhat unnaturally, "But a privileged class like the Zhong family is not a good thing for the Federation to begin with. Could it be that those pig-headed politicians who only know how to compromise and exchange benefits, who only know how to wave their arms and use beautiful but illusory words to incite the stupid people, who slammed the table and scolded us while secretly taking our money and playing with the women we gave them are a good thing for the Federation? This was the problem of the lack of system and monitoring, but the system itself was much better than the 7 families or the political system of the dynasty even further away. Even if the stupid people's choices were very stupid, and even if the people they chose were very sad, they were only allowed to choose but they still had some right to choose." Sulu wanted to refute the other, but when he thought of his experience after escaping to the capital ring and the strange stories that the uncle had experienced, he lost the will to refute the other. "Now you are the highest commander of the Federation's front line. President Pabre has always given you the most selfless support, bearing the strong pressure from the parliament and the political circle. As far as I know, the Department of Defense has never interfered with your command in any details," he said. That is all history. Forgetting history means betrayal, not to mention that history is now. When the dynasty ended, the Federation government and the 7 families shared the benefits equally. Only the Zhong family was chased out of the rich capital ring and stationed in the barren East Woods. When they discovered the treasure in East Woods, we were chased out of East Woods by such a despicable and disgusting scheme and came to the barren West Woods. Now that we are about to attack the Empire, the West Woods will be the Federation's most important native region. Where is the Federation going to chase the Zhong family? I named the girl Zhong Huoyan because I want her to remember what this newborn Federation did to the Zhong family many years ago. Child, you have to be alert. This Federation will continue to do such things to us in the future. Sulu thought of the cute little watermelon, the weight that she might have to bear on her thin shoulders in the future, and the origin of her name. He could not help but silently say the words that had been passed down in his hometown by the ancestors of the Zhong family after the warship crashed. My mood right now is lonelier than fireworks. The Federation wants to destroy the Zhong family, and they are trying to destroy the Zhong family right now, just like the warship that exploded into fireworks years ago. Zhong Shouhu raised his eyebrows slightly and said calmly, I look forward to it. Chapter 498. In the face of a major event that could happen, in the face of the overall will of the politicians and the people, and in the face of a historical trend that went against everything, the fact that the head of an aristocratic family who was behind the times could so calmly and provocatively say the words, I am looking forward to it, was incomparably fierce. Sulu had seen many people who acted arrogantly and had extraordinary free and easy temperaments. For example, Lin Banshan, who broke out of his family and treated the tradition of aristocratic families like broken shoes and built a good place for himself in the Jianghu. For example, the madam who hid behind the curtain and made waves in the Federation. For example, the uncle who dared to fight to the death against the glory of the Charter. However, after hearing these words, he was still fiercely shocked. The tone of the tiger of the West Woods was very calm. He was not arrogant but indifferent. However, there was an unquestionable confidence that came from his bones. Where did this arrogance and free and easy come from? Absolute power leads to absolute authority. Sulu silently thought of this sentence. He was somewhat moved by the middle-aged man's temperament, but he did not think that what he revealed would really be the history that was about to happen. According to the logical judgment of his engineer mind, he did not think that the Federation would make a move against the Zhong family again. This was because it did not fit the current situation. The war between the Federation and the Empire burned like wildfire and would probably invade the Empire's space next year. In recent constitutional years, the Federation government and the 7 major families had always carefully maintained a certain balance and harmony. How could they be the first to instigate internal strife in the Federation before the Great War? It had to be known that the Zhong family of the West Woods was an extremely important part of the Federation's strategy. In this part, stability was always the overriding political need. He spoke frankly of his judgment. After a moment of silence, Zhong Suahu, who was drinking and eating, replied with a smile, Our family is always different from the other 6 families. Was it because the Zhong family had always held military power in their hands? Sulu sank into a certain kind of thinking that he was not good at. I've always had a good impression of Mr. President. Although I'm in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'll never be able to be like those shameless government officials in the remote Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'll never be able to show admiration on my face like a mistress looking at her lover. There was still no expression on Zhong Shouhu's face as he said, The government of the Federation is not the embodiment of the collective will of the people, nor is it the embodiment of the will of an excellent politician who is born with a small probability. Instead, it is the embodiment of the collective will of a large group of people who have vested interests in the government. The bureaucrats and businessmen who control the media and finance, who are good at manipulating elections and instigating public opinion, are the mainstream of the Federation. No matter how clear-headed and calm President Pabre is, he is only one person. At most, he can influence the people around him or the young students in Linhai province, but he doesn't have the power to change the direction of the Federation's history. I can even be sure that once he tries to change these things, he will immediately step down. Zhong Shouhu looked at Sulu with a faint and mocking expression, as if he was looking at the young students in Linhai province who were full of a sense of justice but could not find a specific solution. Sulu thought of the role played by Macho in the last presidential election, the role played by Shi Qinghai and himself, and the dark deals and disputes behind the scenes of the election. He could not help but fall silent and acquiesce to Commander Zhong's opinion. Suddenly, he was a little worried about the president in the capital ring, because he knew that the president with a dark complexion was not a politician who was willing to go with the flow. That's all for these matters. Zhong Shouhu rubbed the wine glass with 3 fingers and said directly, "Next, we can talk about the increase of the military's right to speak in the Federation's political structure with the appearance of the Imperium, and the necessity of dispersing the military." Sulu was already very used to the rhythm of the conversation between big shots like Commander Zhong. He was used to them rudely and straightforwardly ending a topic and starting a new one. However, when he heard this series of questions with a strong academic tone, his face naturally flashed with a stunned and depressed expression. Zhong Shouhu looked at him mockingly, drank the wine, and said with a slightly hoarse voice, "This is a joke." Sulu shrugged and quickly replied, "Maybe the central computer can hear it?" "This is a very cold joke." Zhong Shouhu raised his eyebrows and said. 2 soldiers with a huge difference in status, age, and experience were having a late-night conversation with red soup, tender meat, and strong wine. Regardless of whether the joke was cold or not, the conversation continued. The most wonderful thing was that both parties seemed to be somewhat comfortable in the conversation. Commander Zhong was the son of an aristocratic family and a top student in the first military academy of the Federation. When he grew up, he led millions of troops on the western border of the Federation and fought against the Imperium alone for more than 10 years. His life experience was very rich and his words were naturally powerful. Sulu was an orphan of the miners in Donglin. He had only completed 6.5 years of national education. His dream in life was to work with machines, but his life was quite exciting. Plus, his uncle had once forced him to read silently in the university library for several years, so he could be considered a scholar. Most importantly, his temperament destined him to be an excellent listener. For example, Zhou Shi Qinghai and Jian Shuier had already proven that. The topic moved away from the heavy politics and conspiracies to the folklore of the various regions of the Federation, the people, the history of literature, Schiller's plays, and the eccentricities of George Carlin. Suddenly, the conversation became much more relaxed. Sulu listened with great interest to the middle-aged man across the table with a trace of domineering criticism. From time to time he would add in a few words. It was really like 2 scholars holding a glass of wine and talking about what difficult books they had recently read. The night gradually deepened. The pot of red soup had not yet dried up, and the fireworks outside the window had long since stopped. Only the slightly cold wind kept blowing through the pitiful glass that no longer existed, brushing against the 2 people's faces and arms. In the end, the topic naturally moved to the matter that concerned the entire universe the most at present, and that was the war. The 2 men's voices did not become passionate because of the alcohol and the life and death on the front line. They calmly and seriously discussed the war on the 3 fallen planets. One talked about the type of formation he had commanded more than 90 divisions to surround the 3,320 planet. Another talked about how he had led a small team to cross a small river. Another talked about the strategic intentions of the Federation that had been planned for a long time and analyzed how the Emperor of the Empire would respond. Another talked about how he had drilled the recruits in the barracks, wondering if this would annoy their old father. Like the morning sun and the morning dew, like the Emperor and the farmer, the difference in status between Zhong Shouhu and Sulu was too great. The level of the topics they talked about was too great. But strangely, because of a very delightful mood, Sulu was not willing to be a listener. Instead, he earnestly shared his own views. Sulu was very excited to have the honor of discussing the macro and details of the war with Commander Zhong. He was able to look at many things in the past year from a different perspective. It was a very rare opportunity to listen to the powerful commander-in-chief of the Federation talk about the intentions of the commanders in space with the tone of a commander. Zhong Shouhu, the legendary warlord, the local tyrant of the West Woods who killed without blinking an eye and ignored the laws of the Federation, was not as cold and terrifying as the people of the Federation thought. Instead, he was more like a young scholar who was thin enough to live in a cramped university dormitory. He was angry because he did not achieve what he wanted and did not have a girlfriend. Sulu stared with his somewhat drunken eyes, holding the wine glass tightly, trying to catch every word in his ears. Such a clear thought appeared in his mind, and he knew that this would be a conversation that he would remember for the rest of his life. Perhaps it was because he had drunk too much wine, but Sulu somewhat inappropriately mentioned the illustrious achievements of the Iron 7th Division on planet 5460. It was because he had drunk too much that the cold and arrogant Commander Zhong did not care that the boy opposite him was obviously poking at his sore spot. He said indifferently, "Du Shaoqing is a smarter pig." Sulu lowered his head, held back a bitter smile, and quickly drank a glass of wine. If the Imperium can't break through the 2 warp holes in a day, they will have to drift in the universe for 6 or 7 years before they can reach the West Woods if they want to attack the homeland of the Federation. The Federal Army is more advanced than the Imperium's bastards from head to toe. They are waiting for the enemy to arrive. How can they not win? The Imperial Expeditionary Force is just a bunch of tired bastards who came from afar with a few crappy guns from 6 or 7 years ago in their hands. No matter who is on the front line, if they can't win against the enemy, then they are stupid pigs. Commander Zhong looked at Su Lu and said, "Even if you are in command of the Iron 7th Division, you can still win." Su Lu raised his head and subconsciously touched his nose. He could not help but sigh softly when he did not notice the ugliness of the 2 holes facing the sky. He had no reason to like Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division, but when he thought of the fierce battle he saw on the front line and the heroic achievements of the Iron 7th Division, he felt that Commander Zhong's evaluation was a bit unfair. After a moment of silence, he said, "The Iron 7th Division advanced the fastest on planet 5460. In fact, the Imperial Expeditionary Force has been in the West Woods for decades. Not many people can defeat them so quickly." If the transfer of the Iron 7th Division to the front line was the most troublesome thing for Commander Zhong, then the fact that Su Lu mentioned was the heaviest part in the hearts of all the soldiers and people in the West Woods. Zhong Suahu was not angry. He said calmly, "The people of the Capital Ring have always complained about the West Woods. They think that we have not driven the Imperial Expeditionary Force out of the West Woods in the past 10 years because the West Woods Military District has failed in its duty on the battlefield." Su Lu seriously looked forward to the other's answer. "We have indeed not done everything we can to liberate the 3 fallen star systems." A complicated emotion appeared on Zhong Suahu's face. There was a bone-chilling coldness in his mockery. "In the West Woods, from me to the most common homeless man on the street corner, we are not willing to sacrifice too much for the Federation, or to be precise, for the slogan of the Capital Ring. This is not because we want to hide any real strength, but because, from the moment the Empire invaded, we have been the ones sacrificing. When the Empire came, it was the men of the West Woods who were fighting. The Empire was crippled, but the Federation was not willing to support us to win the final victory. Because there is an old man who thinks that the Federation needs to keep those bastards of the Empire to train his troops. So the Federation resolutely and coldly carried out the West Woods strategy of taking turns to fight for more than 10 years. Zhong Suahu looked at him. There was a faint storm in his calm eyes. He said word by word, "Taking turns to fight on the land of the West Woods people? This based on what?" Hearing the words "old man," Su Lu was shocked into silence. He did not know what to say. Chapter 499. There was an old man on the shore of Lake Feiqing. Everyone in the Federation, from the president to the street vendors, was used to calling him old man with great respect and affection. The uncle in the mine pit, who was chewing wild beef with red wine, disdainfully called him old man. Su Lu had also called him old man before, but it did not mean that he had the confidence and qualifications to ignore this person's brilliance. Old man? There was actually someone in this universe who dared to call the god of war so indifferently and mockingly? Su Lu did not hide the shock in his eyes as he stared at Zhong Sugu across the table. Zhong Sugu was, in a sense, the most powerful person in the West Woods, and the god of war Li Pifu that he coldly mentioned earlier was undoubtedly the most powerful person in the Federation. This had nothing to do with the political system. It was purely a manifestation of the people's fanatical worship and the military's will, even in the West Woods. However, Zhong Sugu said so with a trace of unwillingness and coldness. The Federation's god of war Li Pifu did not hesitate to use the West Woods as a training ground to deliberately keep the remaining Imperial Expeditionary Force in the West Woods in order to plan for the space war that would span across several constitutional calendars. He deliberately let the Federal Army, who was in a temporarily peaceful era, constantly smell the smell of blood and smoke, get used to the cruelty of war, and improve the combat power of the troops. This was a strategic arrangement that was easy to guess. It was even a state that many people in the upper echelons of the Federation were aware of. However, what was a little cold was that in the past 10 years, no one in the Federation had made any comments about this, even if they knew how unfair and cold-blooded this strategic arrangement was to the citizens of the Fallen Star and to the entire Westwoods region. It was the same for Su Lu. When he heard the middle-aged man across the table disdainfully call him an old man, his mind buzzed as he remembered the fact that he should have understood a long time ago. He accepted the Federation's strategy that Federation youths like him had been deliberately forgetting. A hint of sincere shame appeared in his heart, and then he fell silent. His outlook on life was not like those old people who disdained and hated. There was only black and white, day and night, light and darkness, a clear flag, tenacious and cold. In fact, he was very clear that there were always all kinds of unavoidable situations in the world, and there were always gray areas. It was only when the gray shadows crossed his bottom line that he reacted violently. War god Li Pifu and the Federation government sacrificed the peace of the entire West Woods region to continuously wear down the Empire's endless and costly expeditions and will. In order to maintain the vigilance of the entire Federation and the combat strength of the entire Federal forces, it was a cold-blooded but strategically correct plan. For the future of the entire Federation and the sustainable development of the entire race in this universe, there was no other word to describe such a strategic plan other than brilliant. Sulu once thought so too. He did not think that the old man's consideration was wrong, but now that he was in the West Woods, surrounded by the West Woods citizens who were tired and even numb from decades of war, and had just returned from the front line filled with the smell of blood and the deserted graves of the early residents of the fallen star, he realized that the people of the West Woods definitely did not think so. Since the beginning of the constitutional era, the West Woods have been at war together. The flames of war have never truly subsided, but there has never been a day when the flames of war burned into the fields and manors of the people of the capital ring. All men of the West Woods have to go through the harshest test of life on the battlefield. In the 3 generations of the Zhong family, more than 100 direct and collateral descendants have died because of this, not to mention the ordinary West Woods citizens. The owner of this restaurant was originally a brother of 4, but he is the only one who can come back alive from the battlefield. Zhong Shouhu's voice became extraordinarily faint, like a cup of coffee that had been mixed with countless cups of water. There was a subtle but unpleasant taste to it. You and I are professional soldiers, guarding the land and protecting the people, serving the Federation, and dying on the battlefield is only natural. But why do we, the people of the West Woods, have to bear the pain of dying generation after generation? The most shameful thing is that it would be fine if we really beat them down. With the bravery of the men of the West Woods, do you think we can't chase those bastards of the Empire out of the planetary system? But the people of the capital ring aren't willing. Zhong Shouhu's lips curled into a deep mocking smile, but it was not clear if he was mocking himself for backing down back then. He said, "War requires logistics and resources, not just the money and love donated by the people of the Upper Woods. Those can buy a good life, but they can't buy true victory. The Federation government doesn't give us these, and we have a serious shortage of energy supply. How can we fight?" He looked at Su Li's slightly lowered eyes and said in a low voice, "In the end, the government is still worried about feeding bandits through war. Continuous aid will fatten the Zhong family, the biggest, most arrogant and most shameless warlord in the universe. Especially that bullshit round robin." Zhong Shouhu's eyes narrowed and coldness gradually filled his eyes. When people are going to die in a tough battle, it will be the people of the West Woods who will go up. The people of the capital ring are like the audience of a play. They will occasionally go on stage and play a few roles, but when the curtain ends, they will have to stand in the middle of the actors and accept Mr. President's handshake and kind reward. Is this fair to the people of the West Woods? Su Lu, who had been silent for a long time, clenched his fists slightly and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "But the old man's strategic plan is not wrong. After all, this is for the Federation. If it's for the Federation, then who will care about the life and death of the people of the West Woods?" Zhong Shouhu looked at him silently. The people of the West Woods are like the orphans of the Federation. They are wandering in the universe, singing sad songs in the west wind. In the end, they can only receive some charity from kind-hearted people. Su Lu suddenly thought of the folk song of the West Woods that he learned on Planet 163, and a faint sense of frustration and sadness grew in his heart. He realized that it was indeed difficult for him to sort out these complicated things with his thinking ability. The night wind blew in through the window and the red soup froze slightly. The atmosphere around the wine table also fell into a frozen silence until Zhong Shouhu smiled and picked up the wine cup to break the awkwardness. He said calmly, "Let's stop the boring topic and change to something more cheerful." "Like what?" Su Lu was somewhat depressed, and it was difficult for him to immediately cheer up with the rhythm of Zhong Shouhu's words. "Like Du Xiaoqing, who once suffered a great loss at your hands. Like you, he is a hero of the Federation deliberately cultivated by the old man and the Federation government. If I say that he is just a slightly smarter pig, would you have a problem with that?" Su Lu smiled bitterly and said, "I don't have a problem with that. I even agree with Uncle Tian's evaluation of teacher Xiaoqing. He is a snowboard demon." You don't have to flatter me. Although I have always thought that Big Stick Tian beating up Du Xiaoqing was definitely in the top 3 of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. Zhong Shouhu laughed 3 times and suddenly stopped smiling. He said solemnly, but Du Xiaoqing is indeed smart. In Academy 1 my grades are not as good as his. I suppressed him to the point that he was not allowed to enter the front lines of the West Woods for 10 years. The Capital Ring and the Department of Defense have a lot of opinions. Do you also think that I am a jealous person? I don't know. Sulu answered honestly. Actually, the reason is very simple. Although I am known as the biggest warlord in the Federation, I am also a citizen of the Federation who grew up in a democratic system. Of course, above that, I am also a citizen of the West Woods. Zhong Shouhu looked at him and said calmly, so as long as I am alive, I will do whatever it takes to suppress Du Xiaoqing and the soldiers he represents. Sulu looked at him in a daze, not understanding what he meant. Du Xiaoqing likes to dress up as the plum blossoms in the snow. He dresses himself up as the most standard professional soldier in the universe. His life goal is to become the second Li Pifu. Zhong Shouhu said with slight mockery, but don't forget that the plum blossoms in the snow are as red as blood. Underneath this person's coldness is the most fanatical heart. I have always remembered that this person once said in a strategy seminar in school. In order to defeat the empire, which has the power of an entire nation, the Federation government needs to be stronger, and the Federation's political structure needs to be more efficient and concise. If such a hardline military officer is allowed to step onto the stage of the Federation, how will the people of the Westwoods live? But that's not the key point. The key point is that from that moment on, I've always felt that there's a very dangerous trend within the Federation, or more precisely, within the military. Some people have a strong desire to change the government system. Sulu wanted to say that he was a typical example of a soldier interfering in politics, but he quickly gulped down a mouthful of wine and almost choked. Zhong Shouhu looked at the night trees outside the window with a serious expression and said in a low voice, "If a military government appears in the Federation, what will become of this world?" Hearing the words military government, Su Li's eyes gradually narrowed. This term was very unfamiliar, but for some reason he felt that the hair on the back of his neck was standing on end because of some kind of chill. His brain worked quickly. The introduction of the military government in the dictionary and the absurd interpretation of several of Master Schiller's plays gradually became clear. Impossible, he said firmly. The Federation has the Bureau of Proclamation. It is impossible for a deformed monster like the military government to appear. Is that so? Zhong Shouhu raised his beautiful eyebrows slightly and said slowly, there was also the Bureau of Proclamation during the Dynasty era. How did His Majesty step down from the Dragon Throne? The glory of the Charter has never been a staunch defender of the Federation's political system. I think that the Bureau of Proclamation will only be a bystander in these aspects. Evidence. This kind of thing requires evidence. Sulu felt a strong sense of danger. He grew up in a democratic society. Although he had experienced the hypocrisy and weakness of the Federation's political system countless times, and he had even done many things that were completely contrary to the spirit of the system, in the bottom of his heart, he still had a childlike stubbornness and naivety. He couldn't accept that the Federation that he loved so much would have a terrifying future where soldiers controlled the will of the people with guns in their hands. At this moment he thought of the assassination in the underground stadium of Linhai. Deputy Minister of National Defense Yang Jingsong and the young officers of the 2nd Military Region, in order to maintain the so-called glory of the military, did not hesitate to use military mechas to launch a shameful attack on a citizen of the Federation. Many images flashed through his mind, overlapping and gradually becoming heavier. However, whether it was the information given by the old man or some of the things he knew, he couldn't persuade him to add such a serious accusation to Du Xiaoqing, even if he didn't like this cold Major General. What evidence did you have before you killed Macklin? Zhong Shouhu asked coldly. Chapter 500. Unlike the approach often used in dramas, after hearing this sentence, Sula did not remain silent in shock and reflect on himself. In the end he shamefully came to a conclusion. Instead, he furrowed his eyebrows that were as thick as ink and as straight as knives and said very seriously, "One of my brothers has already obtained evidence that Medellin was involved in the terrorist attack, and we handed it over to the Federation. However, the Federation's laws had already lost their effect at that time, so I had to do it myself. And before I killed Medellin I asked him myself and he admitted it. Zhong Sugu's cold question was meant to go straight to Su Li's heart and reveal the murderous intent hidden in this young man's heart to refute his questioning of evidence. However, he never expected that Su Lu, who was sitting across the table, would actually respond very seriously like a law student, like a stubborn and serious child. This was a very clever young man. Zhong Sugu quietly looked at Su Lu and became even more certain of his opinion. He said self-deprecatingly, "You're right, I don't have evidence. In fact, if I had evidence I would have sent someone to kill Du Xiaoqing a long time ago." The Westwood's commander raised his eyebrows and said with a bit of coldness, "I respect your ideas in certain aspects of self-hypnosis, but I still want to remind you that when your President Pabre is ousted by the military officers in the future, remember our conversation today? Your president." Since the last election, Su Lu seemed to have heard this saying on many occasions. However, because of the different occasions, the meaning of this saying was very different. Mr. Sher said this because he was proud of himself for influencing the Federation's presidential election, but Zhong Sugu's words represented the unanimous opinion of many of the big shots in the Federation's upper echelons. In their view, the president had pardoned Su Lu and spared no effort to cultivate this person with the military. Naturally, he had some expectations. In the future political landscape of the Federation, His Excellency the President, the 7 great families, and the bureaucrats and politicians would undoubtedly have many conflicts of interest, and Su Lu would definitely stand on the side of President Pabre. The excellent impression he had of the president in the past years, the extraordinary political integrity and decisiveness that the Federation politician had demonstrated during the Medellin incident, the few but very deep interactions they had in the past 2 years, listening to his words, observing his actions, and eating the stewed potatoes cooked by the First Lady herself. Su Lu knew that he had already been branded with the faint mark of an official residence, but he did not reject it. Instead, he felt honored. Listening to Commander Zhong's sarcastic words, the crazy picture of Mr. President being aimed at by countless gun barrels appeared in his mind. He couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. He raised his eyebrows and said, "There is no evidence or even evidence. Just because of a scene in school that year, you want to put teacher Xiaoqing into the ranks of fanatical officers. Although I also hate this guy, this is too ridiculous." Zhong Shouhu frowned and waved his hand. "That makes sense. Is it because he wanted to steal my wife back then?" Su Lu was stunned and speechless. Since the commander-in-chief of the Federation had already changed the topic to what happened in the first military academy back then, it was naturally not convenient for him to say anything. Zhong Shouhu slightly raised his chin and said unruly, "I hate Du Xiaoqing very much, so I will crush him for the rest of his life." A mere major general, and yet a division commander uses a lieutenant colonel as his attendant. I will use a colonel. As long as I am alive, I can only be the commander-in-chief of the front line. I have suppressed him for 10 years. Even if I die, he will have to endure for a long time before he can reach my current position. The most important point is that the Federation wants his Iron 7th Division to show its fierce side on the front line. I will definitely let the entire Federation know who is the real fierce one on the battlefield. Is this a child's fit of pique? Su Lu opened his eyes wide and asked in a serious and joking tone. This question that seems interesting to me but seems boring and childish to you ends here. Zhong Shouhu no longer paid attention to Su Li's rare rich facial expression. He opened the 3rd bottle of wine on the table and poured himself a cup. Then he asked thoughtfully, "One last question. When do you think the war between the Federation and the Empire will truly end?" Hearing this question, Su Lu slowly straightened his sweaty body and looked at the other party in surprise. How could a war that had lasted for almost 100 years end? This was a question that seemed to be more macro and complicated than the universe. Facing the hundreds of millions of vicious and cruel invaders of the Empire and facing the crazy and warlike Emperor of the Empire, even though the Federation had always held the strategic initiative, no one dared to say when this war would end or how it would end. He had learned a lot about quantum physics from Professor Shin, and he had also been exposed to astrophysics before. He knew a lot about this materialistic world. However, when he heard this question, he still felt that Commander Zhong was probably too drunk to discuss what should have been discussed in the Federation's joint staff meeting with a lieutenant colonel like him. Zhong Suohu looked at him with interest, waiting for his answer. Under this kind of gaze, Su Lu had no choice but to think very seriously and give an absolutely sincere answer. Only after the Empire is driven out of the West Woods, and then the Federation forces enter the Empire's space sector and annihilate its basic forces, will the Empire suffer so much that they will never dare to start a war again. Only then can the Federation achieve true peace. Naive. Commander Zhong immediately commented without holding back. Sulu scratched his head. He knew that this idea was naive, but after the catastrophe, the Federation had been living and developing in this universe peacefully. Except for the pirates in Bermuda, they had never encountered any real war. In Schiller's script, all wars will end at some point. Those mythical kingdoms have fought absurdly for more than 600 years for a rose, but the war will eventually come to an end. That's a drama? Zhong Shouhu corrected him without holding back. Even if Schiller's description is something that really happened in history, it can't be used as a model. Don't forget that in those ridiculous Knights' Wars, the nobles on both sides only need to spend some gold coins to return to their hometowns. The ones who died were all farmers and hunters of the lower class. And the war between the Federation and the Empire is a war between races. Even prisoners of war rarely appear. From top to bottom, how many people have died and how much blood has been shed? Most importantly, our great war god of the Federation once killed their emperor with his own hands. So what? Sulu looked at him in confusion. The emperor of the empire maintains his rule because of the purity of his bloodline and the legitimacy of the so-called continuity of power. Whether it's the crazy emperor now or the future emperor of the empire, because of these factors, they will definitely avenge the former emperor who died at the hands of Li Pifu. This is the so-called blood feud. You can also call it the vengeance of the world. Today there are many problems within the empire. The royal family and nobles can still hypnotize those lowly soldiers to charge into the West Woods without any regard for their lives. It's because of the absolute correctness represented by the flame of vengeance. And then? Sulu listened carefully. This war will end unless the Federation destroys the empire. But our system can't copy the British and rear their people like pigs and dogs, because in our society there is always the so-called universal humanitarian bullshit that doesn't distinguish between friend and foe. So the empire's people will rebel, and we will continue to kill the empire's people until they are all killed. Or the empire will destroy the Federation and drown us in a warm water tank like fish. Other than these two situations, are there no other possibilities? Sulu asked, scratching his head. Yes. Zhong Suahu looked at the hopeful expression on his face and said mockingly, the Federation will immediately admit defeat and submit to us. Then they will strip the war god naked, tie him up, and send him to the Empire's Tianjing planet for the Empire's emperor to hack into pieces. Sulu waved his hand in annoyance, indicating that this cold joke wasn't funny. With your intelligence you should be able to tell that this is a joke. Zhong Shouhu continued his unrestrained mockery. Everyone in the Federation knows that this is a joke. The government and the military know better than anyone how difficult it is to end this war. They know that although the Federation is much better than the Empire in terms of economic and technological strength, to truly and completely destroy the Empire and bring peace to the Federation, a more powerful and efficient government is very much needed. But because the positions of the government and the military are different, they cast their thoughts in two different directions to solve this problem. Some people in the military believe that the Federation needs wartime control and establish a military government to make the media, the public and those mercenary giant corporations behave and speak less loudly. You're back to square one again, Sulu said with a shrug. Zhong Shouhu ignored him and continued, and the hardliners in the government believe that a powerful and efficient government capable of winning this war must dig out the abscess in the body of the Federation from its roots. That is, the 7 great families who have been standing in the shadows and watching coldly from the sidelines. Especially in the West Woods, the Federation government must have absolute control over this star sector. To control the Zhong family, they must eliminate me, which is why today's murder occurred. I admit that your analysis is very reasonable, but I want to remind you that the target of the assassination was me. Even if I was just a cover, I still can't believe it. If the mastermind behind this is the Federation government, why would they be so petty in their actions today? This is far from your reputation as the Tiger of the West Woods, Sulu analyzed seriously. I have the same feeling, Zhong Shouhu said with a smile. In this part of the universe, if they really want to kill me, the Federation government must send an army over. But I'm really curious, with so many pairs of eyes watching, who would dare to send an army to kill me, the commander-in-chief of the front lines? After drinking, the two people at the table discussed the general trend of the universe in their drunkenness. Being blown by the night wind of the sunset state, they felt a bit happy. While Sulu was thinking silently, Zhong Shouhu had already stood up, picked up the general's uniform from the back of the chair, and put it on his shoulders carelessly. He staggered and prepared to leave. Sulu stood up to see him off and asked seriously, "Why are you telling me this?" Zhong Shouhu turned sideways, stared at the young man's honest and sincere face and said, Because you are Su Lu. Su Lu said, I still don't understand. Zhong Shouhu held the general's uniform and was silent for a moment. His beautiful eyebrows raised slightly and he said with a smile, because I admire you, a rare young man in the Federation, a silent rock. Although I am the commander-in-chief of the former enemy of the Federation, I am also in the mood to chat. It's just that I can't find anyone to talk to about these things. This is a pretty good explanation, Su Lu thought in his heart. However, he couldn't help but feel that this conversation by the window and the pot was hiding a bit of Autumn's sadness. He didn't know if it was because Sillin was an orphan or because of the shadowy political reality that made him think this way. I also admire you very much. He thought of the little girl in S1 Shisha State and suddenly asked in a suppressed voice, but aren't you entrusting me to someone else? Zhong Shouhu was startled, and then he laughed with incomparable arrogance. Don't overestimate yourself and don't underestimate the strength of a family that has survived for tens of thousands of years in the universe. Especially, don't underestimate me. Su Lu rubbed his nose somewhat awkwardly. He suddenly raised his head and said, at the beginning I said that your nephew was involved in this murder. Zhong Shouhu looked at him with a strange expression. He had probably never seen such a stubborn and unyielding young man in his life. He extended a finger and said seriously, this time, it's you who has come back. Su Lu tacitly agreed. How is your relationship with my daughter? Zhong Shouhu asked. Su Lu saw the watermelon-skinned black hair that rippled with his movements. He said seriously, like brother and sister. There are too many juniors in the family. If my nephew isn't a bastard, what will happen to my daughter in the future? What will happen if I die? Do I really have to entrust you to someone else? Zhong Shouhu looked at him calmly, then reached across the table and rudely rubbed Su Li's hair like an elder. Then he turned and left, his back showing the vicissitudes of life. Zhong Ziki was involved in the murder case this time. With Su Lei's temperament of forcing the enemy to swallow him down, he would definitely not let it go just like that. Whether it was through legal means or official channels, he would make the other party pay the price, even if he was the most beloved nephew of Tiger Shilin. But before Zhong Shouhu left, he asked him about his relationship with Little Watermelon and asked him what he should do. It was as if a bucket of ice water had been poured into Su Li's drunken head. Su Lu suddenly became incomparably sober. He finally understood why a person like Tiger Shilin would have an idiot like Zhong Ziki as his successor. A deep chill towards aristocratic family schemes took over his entire body. Walking out of the restaurant, Su Lu looked at the convoy disappearing in the direction of Latitude 2 district and couldn't help but shake his head. Without the accompaniment of liquor and red soup pot, the night wind in Sunset Province was a little cold. He immediately fastened the collar of his military uniform. The black car drove over like a ghost. Su Lu opened the door and sat in. He quietly listened to Bai Yulan describe the specific details of the mission and sincerely thanked her. The 7 groups of military vehicles that had been waiting for a long time also followed, closely surrounding the black car. They vigilantly started and drove toward the camp. Looking at the scene that he had long been accustomed to through the glass, Su Lu suddenly realized that he was no longer the poor mining orphan, nor was he the little gatekeeper of Yue University, nor was he the engineer who took the high-speed rail between the capital and Hong Kong. Although he was only a young lieutenant colonel, he already had a certain amount of influence in the Federation. He could even drink and chat with a legendary figure like Zhong Shouhu all night long. This conversation was extremely important to him. He, who was more familiar with machines and firearms, had never had enough acumen to see clearly the foggy political side of the Federation. Tonight, Zhong Shouhu's seemingly casual discussion made him suddenly see the light and understand many things. These and the last sentence made Su Lu feel that this tiger of the West Woods was indeed not an ordinary person, and he was definitely not someone he could compare to. Commander Zhong, whose words and actions could influence the general trend of the universe, had a way of thinking and perspective that was so sharp and profound. He even naturally had a thought. Zhong Shouhu and Du Xiaoqing were known as lifelong enemies by many busybodies. However, looking at it today, how could Du Xiaoqing defeat such a seemingly poor and pedantic person who was actually cold and sharp? After the fireworks tonight, clouds slowly moved in from the east, covering the stars above the clear atmosphere. Outside the window, the streets of Sunset State became darker and blurrier. Su Lu tilted his head and looked out of the window like a statue. He was silent for a long time. He did not agree with some of Commander Zhong's assertions because there was no actual evidence. However, Some of the things he had experienced in the past 2 years made him faintly feel that a dangerous thought was indeed emerging among the young officers of the Federation. This thought had not surfaced but was only fermenting and brewing. Want to establish a military government? There was no such possibility in the Federation. After a long period of serious consideration, based on the clear logical thinking of engineers, understanding of the political structure of the Federation, and the 700,000-word First Charter, Sulu made his own judgment. He sighed in relief, and his admiration for Zhong Shouhu grew even stronger. As the top of the privileged class in the Federation, the lonely tiger of the West Woods, this person was worried about the future of the Federation and sincerely protected the system of the Federation. How could he not be admirable? He thought of his friend Tai Ziyuan, who seemed to have the same excellent qualities. It seemed that there were good people in the 7 great families. It was just that Tai Ziyuan always had the bad aura of a crown prince. Sigh, young people. Sulu sighed and shook his head. With the end of the arrest in Sunset State, the murder case officially came to an end. The Westwoods military took this opportunity to purge the people planted by various factions in the capital ring on the main planet. A total of more than 70 suspects were arrested and were awaiting trial. Among these arrested suspects, more than 50 people belonged to the relevant departments of the government. The Zhong family of the Westwoods sent the most powerful warning to the people of the capital ring in such a cold and brutal way. It must be mentioned that the name list and related evidence sent to Sulu by the Federal Central Computer played a significant role in this purge. Everything was calm. Sulu did not hand over the evidence of Zhong Ziqi's involvement to the higher authorities of the government, nor did he take Group 7 to carry out private revenge. However, not many people noticed that a team member named Shipeng left the camp and boarded the warship back to the capital ring. On the day Shipeng left the camp, Sulu saw her off personally. At the gate in the morning he said, "I know you mean no harm." Shipeng's face was a little pale. She looked at the familiar barracks and remembered that her closest comrades were still sleeping. After a moment of silence she said, "Some of the information was indeed leaked by me, but I didn't know they wanted to kill you. That's not the point. The point is that we are a team. We have to leave our backs to each other on the battlefield. In fact, we did the same on Planet 163, Sulu said, but this matter makes it difficult for me to continue trusting you." Shipeng nodded and said, "I understand, but don't expect me to be moved to tears by your words and become your follower. That's something that only exists in novels," Sulu said. Then the two of them shook hands gently and said goodbye. Silan's Sunset State was calm and tranquil, but the people of S1 Capital Special District found it very difficult to maintain such composure. The government officials and the members of the management committee were utterly troubled by Silan's intense reaction. They began to investigate angrily, trying to figure out who was stupid enough to try to assassinate that tiger with a sniper rifle. If the assassination attempt on Commander Zhong was more like a joke, then the real assassination attempt on Sulu made countless people feel uneasy, especially those who knew the inside story. After confirming that the long-planned assassination attempt did not make Sulu disappear forever, they all made the fastest and most accurate reaction. Lin Daohai, who was riding a fierce horse in the Western Peninsula Meadow Racecourse, was violently dragged off the horse by several burly men from his family. Then in a short 10 minutes he boarded a helicopter, switched to the family's private spaceship, and entered Planet S3. Then he was closely guarded in the Lin family's private manor that covered an area of thousands of square kilometers. This was the Lin family's severe punishment for this good-for-nothing successor. But from another perspective, the house arrest was also because the family elders were very worried that the young lieutenant colonel would repeat the Macklin horror incident. Meanwhile, Nan Mingxiu, who was making a passionate speech in the building of the Parliament Hill to win the mysterious admiration of the female members of the Parliament, was brought back to S2 by the anti-government military personnel of Green Dragon Mountain as quickly as possible. Sadly, he returned to the barren mountain village that he tried so hard to escape from, and returned to the side of his father, the leader he was most afraid of. In addition, the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain also sent a congratulatory message to Group 7, who was far away in the West Woods, through Zhang Xiaoming, who was stationed in the capital ring. They congratulated them on their dazzling achievements on the front line under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. Although this congratulatory message was neither fish nor fowl, it represented a certain attitude. All parties were expressing their views in their own ways. The big shots were wary of Su Li's perseverance and stubbornness, but what worried them more was, in fact, the possible anger that might appear in Philadelphia. Many people in this universe had flipped out, but if the old man beside Lake Feiqing flipped out, Even the 7 families would not be able to bear it. However, to many people's surprise, there was no response from Philadelphia. That's because Madame couldn't stand it anymore. No one would have thought that Tiger Zhong would actually use these little guys' tricks to create such a big scene. Speaking of which, like Madame, I really suspect that the killer in room 1302 was added by Tiger Zhong after he knew that someone was going to kill Sulu. On the top floor of the headquarters of Sanlin United Bank, the skinny old man wearing a funny little hat sat in his exclusive chair. He looked at Li Xiaozhu in front of him and said with a smile, "You did a good job this time. We are financiers, not killers. You know that the profession of a killer is always too dangerous." Chapter 501. The Ministry of National Defense didn't give them any new missions, so Group 7 stayed in their barracks and trained day after day. Even Xiong Lin Quan, who was full of adrenaline and sadism, started to feel bored. Apart from being blinded by the slaughter in front of the battlefield, being shocked by the miserable deaths of their comrades, or drinking too much alcohol during the mobilization before the battle, no one would be willing to go to the front line that was full of death again. However, this kind of waiting was really tormenting the team members' nerves that were getting hardened day by day. Therefore, when the Sunset region welcomed a rare cloudy day, the brutal and bloody training in Group 7's barracks also welcomed a rare holiday. Some of the members began to gather together to play cards and gamble, while others lay on the hammocks under the trees and listened to music. Major Lan Xiaolong, on the other hand, led Song Xiang, Yan Bingyan and dozens of other men to roar and kill their way to the seaside beach that they had longed for a long time. They were prepared to use their burning gazes to kill those silly girls with bathing suit marks on their youthful bodies. 40 minutes later, this group of people returned to the barracks dejectedly and began to look for leisure activities that they could reluctantly accept. The reason was simple. Today was a rare cloudy day in the Sunset region. The chilly wind was blowing by the seaside, and it was wet and cold to the bone. All the beautiful girls in swimsuits had probably stayed at home. Lan Xiaolong nagged non-stop in his sarcastic tone. He walked angrily to Bai Yulan's side and lit a cigarette. He suddenly frowned and looked at Su Lu, who was sitting on a bench at the entrance. He asked Bai Yulan, "Why did our boss become a statue again? Does he think that his small eyes are very charming?" The team members called Su Lu many different names. Some called him Sir, most called him Boss. Only Bai Yulan insisted on calling him Boss or Little Boss, probably because he always remembered the 10 million yuan bank card. Boss received a very strange congratulatory message, so he's having a headache, Bai Yulan said softly. Congratulatory message? That's a good thing. Commander Ship 163 sent it from the headquarters? Don't tell me it's from the Ministry of National Defense, Lan Xiaolong said in surprise. None of them. Bai Yulan brushed the hair in front of her forehead and said softly, Azure Dragon Mountain. The cigarette trembled between Lan Xiaolong's lips. Fortunately, it did not fall to the ground and fall into the dust. He was shocked for a long time before he could speak. What the fuck does it have to do with the anti-government army? Could it be that Green Dragon Mountain thinks that just because our leader has some sort of relationship with that beautiful female guerrilla fighter of theirs, we are their troops? Isn't this too fucking ridiculous? Bai Yulan shrugged her shoulders and said, It is indeed ridiculous. Where did all this nonsense come from? Su Lu scratched his swollen eyebrows. With an annoyed expression, he stood up and said to Lan Xiaolong, I must declare that this congratulatory message from the Azure Dragon Mountain Central Committee is not for me personally, but for our, He looked down at the contents of the congratulatory message on his military cell phone and read, A group of heroic heroes? Nutshell 7. After hearing this dramatic tone, I can finally confirm that this congratulatory message came from Green Dragon Mountain. Lan Xiaolong made a serious judgment. No matter how you look at it, it is still an honor. Su Le handed the cell phone to Bai Yulan and said, Since it is a congratulatory message for us 7, read it to everyone. I am better at this kind of thing. Back in school, I was the main force of the drama club. Lan Xiaolong snatched the cell phone from Bai Yulan's hands and shrugged. It is such a boring day. Reading some boring words can be considered a boring way to pass the time. Everyone gather. He chased away a few members who were playing cards and stood on the table. He shouted to the surrounding people, Don't panic. This is not a drill, but we don't need you to go to war. We just have a weird congratulatory message to read to you. The members in the camp all roared with laughter and then gathered around. Sulu did not go over. He sat alone on the camp bench with a cigarette in his mouth. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the rarely seen gray sky. He could not help but think of the never-changing sky of his hometown, Donglin. Lan Xiaolong's extremely exaggerated recitation of the congratulatory message and the cheerful laughter of the members came from the other side. A smile appeared on his face, but then his thoughts drifted away. He had been on the front line for a long time. He had received many concerned emails from the capital ring. Zhouyu, Jian Shuier, Little Watermelon, Shangqiu, Li Xiaotong, and that beautiful Miss Nan Xiangmei. Even the Wangdu Apartment Owners Committee had sent him a warm and enthusiastic letter. However, he had not received a single letter from Zhang Xiaoming. This could no longer make him feel disappointed or depressed. He just did not know why, but there was always a faint displeasure in his heart. It was rare to receive an email from her today, but it turned out to be a weird congratulatory message from the Central Committee of Green Dragon Mountain. Thinking of this, he could not help but smile bitterly. His smile suddenly froze. He suddenly turned around and heard the voice on the other side. He stood up angrily and shouted, "Don't read my personal email." Zulu, hello. This is the 7th letter I've written to you. In the previous letter, I mentioned that I was working at the S2 Peace and Reconstruction Foundation. Of course, don't misunderstand. This foundation has nothing to do with the one in Macklin. I studied education in university, and now I'm a teacher in a village near Green Dragon Mountain in the Oak State. I just want to share some of the happiness of being with those children in peace with you. I know that these letters can be sent to your mailbox, so please don't pretend that you didn't receive them. Although I know that your life on the front line may be very tense and busy, I think that if you set up an automatic return to your mailbox, I might be a little happier. There were cheers and whistles in the barracks mixed with whispers. There are still 6 months before I have to return to the capital. I don't know when you'll return to S1. I really hope that when the time comes we'll have the opportunity to meet. I don't want to forever see your figure in the news channel's documentaries. Although your figure in the smoke of battle with Group 7 always makes me and many of my peers cry, but you're wearing sunglasses in those documentaries so I can't see your eyes. There were howls and whistles in the barracks, mixed with excited profanities. Finally, I want to say that I've never tried to so unreasonably and impolitely ask a member of the opposite sex to respond to me with just a few words. I'm really a little ashamed. However, just like the words I repeated at the end of the previous 6 letters, do you remember what I said to you in the garden of Wood Valley Manor? I miss your Southern Prime Minister. Don't panic, don't panic. There's also a blushing emoji at the end. The barracks suddenly exploded. Lan Xiaolong's excited laughter was still very clear in the midst of the clamor of his team members. Su Lu, who could fight against 1,000 soldiers, was helplessly blocked out by his team members today. He shouted angrily, but no one paid him any attention. Fuck, these guys weren't as fierce on the battlefield as they are today. Su Lu, who was once again pushed out by his team members, looked at his team members who were listening to his private letters with embarrassment, and angrily criticized them. That's because the Empire's people on the battlefield are definitely not as attractive to them as these letters. Beside him, Bai Yulan patted his shoulder comfortingly. She suddenly thought of something and frowned. Southern Prime Minister? Last time on Grey Peak you said that you also liked her. She is this girl? Su Lu paused for a moment and then explained, "Those were my last words. At that time I thought that I was going to die. Of course, I hoped that after I died she would feel better. The question is, do you like her or not?" Bai Yulan looked into his eyes and asked softly like an emotional columnist. Su Lu lowered his eyes and remained silent. His biggest problem now was that he didn't know who to like. Pay attention. This letter is signed off by Zhou. Do you know who this is? The beloved daughter of our great minister Zhou Yingxing. Su Lu had already lost the energy to stop this farce. He stared fiercely at Lan Xiaolong, who was salivating at the table, and thought about which military discipline he should use to punish this person later. Fortunately, these unclassified letters did not involve his or other people's secrets. After thinking about it, he could only let his team members enjoy this rare carnival. Zhou letter was as simple and cold as the red-clothed mother's temperament. There weren't many words, but they hit the nail on the head. If you're not dead, write back and let me know. If you're dead, don't tell me. Remember to die far away. Lan Xiaolong and his team members were shocked. They thought that the Minister of Defense's daughter was indeed extraordinary. Even if it was a small grudge between lovers, she could express it so magnificently and viciously. Su Lu was too lazy to pay attention to these people's deliberate misinterpretation. However, he suddenly thought of the next letter on his phone. His pupils shrank nervously. He was prepared to do whatever it took to prevent this from happening, but he found that it was already too late. This was a video message. Lan Xiaolong turned on the external hologram of his phone. The next moment, all the team members in the barracks saw the image on the hologram and collectively took a deep breath. It was an extremely beautiful pair of red lips, exaggeratedly occupying the entire hologram. The owner of the red lips pulled away from the camera, revealing a perfect face that all the men in the Federation recognized. Jian Shuer smiled like a flower, and her eyes cutely narrowed into 2 crescent moons. She crisply said, "Sulu, this is to cheer you on. Come back soon." The team members recognized this face. When they heard this sentence, the collective sound of deep breaths suddenly became incomparably loud. It was like a hollow hole in a nutshell engineering department, and the sound was like muffled thunder. Everyone in Team 7 knew that there had been a sensational scandal between their boss and the nation's girl. However, seeing the naked evidence with their own eyes today, their feelings were naturally very different. After the video message finished playing, after a deathly silence, everyone collectively turned around and nailed Sulu to the ground with shocked, envious and jealous gazes. Sulu stubbornly straightened his chest. Suddenly he noticed 2 sneaky figures on the periphery of the crowd. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he coldly said, "Cut this or don't blame me for being rude." The production duo from the Venus documentary studio had lived and fought with Team 7 for a long time. The team members had long been accustomed to each other's existence. The reporter and host, who was rumored to win countless awards for the documentary Team 7, keenly discovered such a great material today. How could he let it go so easily? He had been secretly filming in the dark. Unexpectedly, in the end it was still discovered by Su Lo. The production crew knew Su Li's personality very well, so they very sadly and helplessly pulled out the data strip. At this moment, the electronic monitoring equipment that Gu Shifeng had set up around the camp suddenly began to emit a sharp sound. The ground began to tremble and strange echoes appeared in the air. The team members who reacted quickly immediately ran to the armory. "It can't be the Empire. They're attacking," Su Lu said with a frown. "Yes." Bai Yulan put her right hand into her pocket and held the delicate bayonet handle. "Then what happened?" Su Li's eyes narrowed again. Chapter 502. Group 7's barracks were located in a quiet, shallow hilly area on the outskirts of Sunset State. It was quite far from the Federal Forces barracks, so not many people came to disturb them. The main planet of the West Woods was now filled with soldiers, battleships and airplanes. The glory of the Charter was everywhere, but this nutshell mercenary army directly under the Ministry of National Defense was still very vigilant in setting up security and surveillance measures. Under Gu Shifeng's arrangement, the precise electronic control equipment could accurately capture any abnormal movement within a 30-kilometer radius. Sharp alarms rang out one after another in the barracks. The members with vigilant expressions were busy, but they did not panic. They used their fastest speed to put on the individual combat systems, carried all kinds of heavy firearms and came to their own defense zone. The warehouse door at the back had already been opened, and the low rumbling sound of military vehicles could rush out at any time. The 7 firing points around the barracks were equipped with heavy firepower, and the black MX mecha had already appeared under the control of the logisticians in the gloomy weather. In this tense and oppressive atmosphere, the shaking of the earth became clearer and clearer, and the noise outside the barracks also became louder and louder. Who knew how many troops were gathering here? Su Li's thick eyebrows were tightly furrowed, but he did not immediately enter battle mode like his team members and board his black mecha. Instead he stared at the tightly shut door. Every movement on this planet was under the surveillance of the charter computer. He did not believe that he would be in any danger without the old man's warning. The next moment, his calm expression could not help but change, and he showed a strong sense of vigilance and alertness. The heavy sound of rolling tanks and the low rumbling of military engines outside the barracks became louder and louder. These sounds broke through the sky, shaking the forest behind the barracks to the point that the birds in the forest behind the barracks were incomparably quiet, shaking the earth non-stop, shaking his face slightly pale. It would take at least a few hundred heavy tanks to drive in at the same time to create such a commotion. This meant that Group 7's barracks were currently surrounded by an entire squadron of mechanics. What surprised Su Lu even more was that beyond the outer walls of the barracks, he could clearly see the cold and stern bodies of dozens of mecha. Those were the Federation's newest model, the MX mecha. Looking down at the barracks from above, they were like gods, naturally exuding an irresistible aura. Sulu raised his eyebrows and flipped over the wall of the barracks. He came to the highest sniping point and looked out the wall. His pair of lively black eyebrows suddenly froze. Beyond the walls of the camp, there was a dense army as far as the eye could see. On the roads and fields, there were close to 1,000 armored vehicles that were actually lined up more than 10 kilometers away. There were also countless huge engineering mechs and military equipment covered in green cloth scattered among them, not to mention those silent tall black mechs scattered all around. It was at least an entire team of mechanics. No, the number of mechas far exceeded the standard equipment of the Federation. Furthermore, the equipment of this team was far more advanced than the average equipment on the battlefield. Just one look was enough to make people tremble in fear. The members of Group 7 in the barracks were all fierce people who had survived the battlefield. However, even as strong as they were, they found it hard to digest what they were seeing right now. If it weren't for the clear Federal Army Gold Star insignia on the equipment of the troops outside the barracks, the team members would even be shocked to think that the people of the Empire had broken through the space tunnel and that the crazy Emperor had sent all of his most terrifying royal guards over, just to crush a small mercenary team of less than 100 people from the Federation. This kind of thinking was absurd, but the team members who were originally planning to vent their frustration of not being able to see the beauties on the beach today could no longer yell with a fierce expression. Instead, they subconsciously lowered the muzzles in their hands and looked at each other, unable to summon any courage to fight. Even the automatic fire system that Gu Shifeng had set up in the barracks was deactivated at this moment. The troops outside the walls occupied the entire land. The ones that truly surrounded Group 7 were only a small number of vehicles in the vanguard. How could their few guns stop such a large number of troops? This unknown group of Federation mechanics probably wouldn't launch an attack on the pitiful camp of Group 7. Sulu, with the calm of an engineer, quickly confirmed this point. Those rumbling war chariots and the dangerous and powerful MX mecha all stopped silently where they were. If their goal was to destroy Group 7, all they needed was a simple cannon barrage or a casual armored charge, and Group 7's barracks and all its members would be reduced to dust. A fleet of vehicles could be faintly seen on the road. He stood on top of the wall in a daze. Suddenly he rubbed his face hard, rubbing his previously pale cheeks until they turned red. Only then did he take a deep breath, jump off the ground and walk toward the door. The door of the barracks slowly opened. More than 10 bulletproof military vehicles with prominent license plates slowly drove in and then with difficulty parked side by side in the not-so-spacious area of the barracks. The team members had already felt that there was something fishy about today's incident. The old team members had sharp eyes, while the new team members had extraordinary family backgrounds. They all discovered an even more shocking truth from the license plates of these military vehicles. The heavy doors of the vehicles opened one by one. More than 20 white-haired big shots wearing formal military uniforms alighted from the vehicles. These big shots all had one thing in common, and that was that they all had one or more shining golden stars on their shoulders. At this moment, Sulu somewhat suspected that all the generals of the Federation had come to his little courtyard. He wondered if he should go up and say welcome to his humble abode, but then he realized that his current emotions were somewhat comical. Among the guests, only 2 were not wearing military uniforms. One was Mr. Nutshell, the CEO that Sulu was very familiar with. This middle-aged man was in control of the largest corporation in the Federation. He looked at him with an admiring and proud gaze, but did not give him any hints. The other was an official with a smile on his face. He was wearing a black formal suit. He was the director of the Office of the President's Residence, Breen. Suli's pupils shrank slightly. This director Breen had a close relationship with Macho in the back of the mountain. Later on, he firmly became the most loyal housekeeper of President Pabre. He was deeply trusted by the president and was an out-and-out powerful figure in the political world of the Federation. In the past year or so, His Excellency the President's concerns and suggestions for him were usually conveyed by this director. And the 2 banquets that he had been honored with in the President's residence were also arranged by this director. But Sulu did not immediately greet the other. Instead, he quickly walked toward those generals with solemn expressions and some kind of emotional expression. Among these generals, there were people with even greater backgrounds than Director Breen. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly Base reporting for duty. Please give me your orders. He stood at attention and looked straight ahead. He gave a very standard military salute to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation and the commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles. The second target of the salute was the Federation's frontline commander-in-chief, the West Woods Tiger, who was looking at him with a very mysterious smile. Then there was Deputy Minister Chin of the Ministry of National Defense, Dean Shi of the 2nd Military Academy, the commander of the 4th Army of the Federation, the Chief of Staff of the West Woods Command. The members of Group 7 had already lined up behind Sulu. They looked straight ahead and allowed the big shots of the military to inspect them. Their excitement was mixed with a strong sense of unease. No one could understand why the big shots of the federal military would collectively come to visit Group 7's camp when the war between the Federation and the Empire was fierce. What made the team members even more confused was that even though these commanders and generals had noble identities, wasn't it a bit too exaggerated to bring an entire team of mechanics as a security force? In the formation, only Lan Xiaolong and Bai Yulan vaguely guessed something. They knew that Sulu might not have found the real common point of these generals, but they clearly caught that point because they had recited the glorious war history of their unit countless times when they first joined the army. Thinking of that possibility, Bai Yulan, who was usually the calmest and most indifferent person, couldn't help but have a hint of excitement on her face. Other than the West Woods Tiger, who was responsible for receiving the people from the capital ring, the military leaders who suddenly came to Group 7's camp today had one thing in common. They were all subordinates of Army Godly Pifu. They were all from the 1st Division of the Federation, the 17th Division. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, General Miles was the real leader of the Federal Army compared to the low-key Defense Minister Zhou Yingxing. Ever since Army Godly Pifu retired to the lakeside of Feiqing, all the command of the federal forces were in his hands. With his hands behind his back, General Miles looked at Sulu and said, "We don't have any instructions. We are just here to announce something." In a short period of time, the engineering team had already set up a temporary platform. The sound system had also been set up. Countless large sound amplification devices were placed around the camp, aimed at the troops outside the barracks that covered the mountains and plains. General Miles, Director Breen, and the CEO of Nutshell walked up to the podium. The rest of the generals had a satisfied smile on their faces as they stood below the podium. Sulu glanced at Zhong Suohu. He knew that in such a public place, there was a huge difference between him and the commander-in-chief of the Federation's frontline. After thinking for a while, he silently returned to Group 7's camp. General Miles looked at the soldiers below the podium with a serious expression. After a few seconds of silence, he said, "President Pabre personally signed the order. According to the military organization regulations of the Federation, the order was passed by the Military Committee of the Management Committee and implemented by the Ministry of Defense. On behalf of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, I officially announce this. The Federation will rebuild the 17th Division." Under the podium, Sulu felt a bit confused. He didn't expect that the news that would shake the entire Federation would be announced so easily by General Miles. The fact that he had been guessing for a long time appeared in front of his eyes so quickly. He was a bit unprepared. General Miles's voice came out of the barracks through the sound amplification system and echoed in the wilderness. It echoed in the ears of the members of Group 7 and the soldiers of the Federation who were waiting solemnly. The troops outside the barracks had traveled countless light years from the capital ring to the West Woods region. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been guessing and waiting. At this moment they finally heard the answer they wanted to hear the most. After a suffocating silence, a thunderous roar of excitement suddenly sounded in the wilderness. Chapter 503. The expressions of the members of Group 7 in the barracks froze for a moment, as if they were awakened by the thunderous cheers outside the walls. They no longer cared about Supervisor Sulu, who had his head slightly lowered, nor did they have the time to pay attention to the big shots not far away. They raised the guns in their hands high up in the air and roared in excitement. They screamed and jumped around randomly. No one was crazy enough to fire a shot into the sky, but countless military caps flew into the gloomy sky today. The troops outside the walls were all equipped with advanced equipment from the Harbor City Guard District and the 1st Military Region. When they heard General Miles announce that the Federation was officially reorganizing the legendary 17th Division, they knew that they were going to be part of the legendary troops of the Federation. Of course they were incomparably excited. Compared to these tens of thousands of soldiers, Group 7 inside the walls seemed to have more reason to be excited and proud. The old members of Group 7 in the nutshell were basically all from the 17th Division. Bai Yulan, who had joined when she was young, had personally experienced the final glory and sorrow of the 17th Division before it was disbanded. As for the new members of Group 7, they were originally the popinjays of the Harbor City Garrison Guard District. They came from Unit 8384, and no matter how this unit had humiliated and infuriated the seniors of the 17th Division over the past few years, the blood in their veins still retained the traces of this legendary majestic division, and their bodies were branded with the mark of the 17th Division. The 17th Division was the only field unit that the Federation's god of war, Lipifu, had served in his entire life. This mighty army had slaughtered its way into the Gary Corridor 3 times, forcefully attacking the heart of the Empire, and had never tasted a single defeat in more than 100 bloody battles. It had the most glorious history of the Federal Army, and had made countless contributions to the Federation. Sulu didn't need anyone to remind him. Like countless other male Federation citizens, he could recite the battle history of this legendary army like the back of his hand. However, in his bones he was still that calm engineer. In addition, he had joined the army halfway, so he hadn't received the training of the army. He wasn't an old member of the 17th Division, so it was difficult for him to understand the emotions of the countless soldiers inside and outside the walls, as well as the countless generals on and off the platform. He looked at the tears and excitement in the eyes of the young and old soldiers. He could understand, but it was difficult for him to fully immerse himself in it. Instead, a faint sense of frustration appeared in his heart. The Federation reorganizing the 17th Division on one hand was to give instructions to the old man, but on the other hand, it was to send a strong message to the entire universe. That was that the Federal forces would definitely be like the 17th Division in the end and obtain the final victory in the end. But what did this have to do with him? The moment this thought appeared, it was instantly shattered. Su Li's lips curled into a bitter smile. The god of war, who was as tall and dangerous as a snowy mountain, had personally rescued him from Allure prison and allowed him to enter the training base as an instructor. Lan Xiaolong had left the garrison area of the port city, reformed Group 7 and urgently recruited soldiers from Unit 8384 on the front lines. All of this had been foreshadowed long ago. His career on the battlefield was bound to be closely linked to the most famous 17th Division of the Federation. Sulu was thinking. No one laughed and no one paid attention. The members in the barracks were so excited that their faces were slightly red. The big shots of the Federal Army were filled with emotions. Everyone was completely focused on everything that was happening on the platform. Director Breen read the congratulatory letter personally written by President Pabre. In the letter, the President passionately reviewed the glorious achievements of the 17th Division in the past battles. Using a sincere tone, he used 17 imposing sentences to look forward to the great future that would happen in the vast universe. He encouraged all the soldiers of the 17th Division and all the troops of the Federation that participated in the battle to inherit the God of War's heroic spirit when the Federation was in dire straits. The last person to give a speech on the stage was the CEO of Nutshell. It was already surprising that the biggest entrepreneur in the Federation would participate in the rebuilding of the most legendary troop of the Federation. In his passionate speech, it was even more puzzling that the focus of his speech was on Nutshell Group 7. He praised the outstanding performance of the members of Group 7 on Planet 5460 and Planet 163, firmly believing that they did not embarrass the 17th Division and Nutshell. He also expressed that he would continue to support the righteous cause of the Federal Army. The film crews of the most important TV stations in the Federation had already entered the barracks. They wanted to use the fastest speed to broadcast this major event that would definitely greatly increase the morale of the Federation. These reporters with extremely sensitive news senses, after witnessing the excitement of history, calmly captured some very interesting clues from the location chosen by the Federation for the announcement and the conversation between the CEO of Nutshell. After the 3 episodes of the documentary were broadcasted on the Federation's news channel, Nutshell Group 7 had already become the most famous combat team in the hearts of the Federation's citizens. Because of the small number of people and the distinct facial features of the members, they were even more popular than the Iron 7 Division. But in the eyes of the reporters, the one with the most news value, the one who was able to link the 17th Division and the 7th Division together, was naturally that. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu. As Nutshell Group CEO's speech ended, countless cameras quickly moved away from the stage. Among the densely packed soldiers in the barracks, they quickly searched for the young Lieutenant Colonel's figure. Meanwhile, the reporters held the microphones in their hands, ready to rush over at any moment. At this time, Su Li's mood was still a little uncertain. He was analyzing what kind of role the president, or rather the old man in Philadelphia, would want him to play in the new 17th Division. He was completely unaware of everything that was happening in the barracks. Suddenly, someone beside him handed him a pair of sunglasses. Sulu was slightly taken aback, but he immediately reacted. He put the sunglasses on his nose bridge, covering half of his face, and sincerely said, "Thank you. You're welcome. I followed you to the front line, washed the bullets, and worked for a few months, but I still couldn't get a picture of your face without sunglasses. To be precise, you didn't let me take a picture. If that's the case, why should I let my colleagues take a picture?" The reporter from the Gold Star documentary studio looked at the disappointed colleagues in the distance and said sarcastically, "Are all the people in the news industry as ruthless as you?" Sulu said, "But by Ziming, you have to remember, before I give you permission, you still can't take a picture of my face without sunglasses. Your whole family is the news industry, I'm the documentary director and narrator." Bai Ziming waved his hand in annoyance, then said, "But in the future, you'll have to show your face in front of the entire Federation. I only hope that you'll leave your first chance to me." "No problem." Sulu smiled. "Actually, I didn't like you before because you were quite kind to everyone, but when you looked at the two of us, you'd always have a deadpan expression." Bai Ziming shrugged and said, "But now that I think back on the past few months, I really feel that it was worth it, even though it was tough." He turned his head to look at Sulu and said seriously, "When I think about how I might be able to follow by the side of the youngest commander in the history of the Federation for so long, and as the commander of the 17th Division at that, I'm excited, I'm proud." Sulu was speechless. He thought to himself that if the president really agreed to let a guy who wasn't even 23 years old become the commander of the 17th Division, not to mention how shocked the entire Federation would be, the First Lady would probably immediately suggest that her husband go see a psychiatrist. The Federation really did carry out the reorganization swiftly and decisively. The new 17th Division's combat decision-making structure and the appointment of officers quickly unfolded in the unassuming barracks of Group 7. There was an endless stream of officers walking into the barracks with excited expressions, receiving their appointment certificates, and saluting in all directions with their trembling right hands. What made Sulu feel incomparably complicated was that he was very familiar with quite a few of these officers. The appointment of the senior military officers was also officially announced. Sulu was not surprised to find that the commander was not himself, but rather a gentle-looking middle-aged major general whom he had never seen before. The appointments of the staff and various department heads were also quickly completed. Among them, Sulu heard quite a few familiar names. Lei Lin Ai, Mizuru Hua Xiaoxi. A quarter of the military officer cadets from the training base were selected by the Ministry of Defense from their respective units and assigned to the new 17th Division. These people had all been Su Li students and had once sung military songs together in the majestic clubhouse. They thought that they would only meet again on the battlefield, but who knew that they would meet again today? Lieutenant Colonel He Lei took on the glorious role of regiment commander of the 1st Regiment. Hua Xiaoxi took on the role of captain of the MX Mecha Brigade specially formed by the new 17th Division. Lin Ai and Gu Shifeng from the academic faction were in charge of the electronic reaction team. Mizuru, who came from the Federal Fleet, took on the role of liaison officer for the new 17th Division with some grievance. Meanwhile, the rest of the cadets also took on important positions. They were different from the mid-level officers trained by the Federation. Nutshell Team 7 was officially incorporated into the federal military structure. Other than Magnolia and a few core members, the rest of the members were all scattered and assigned to basic positions in the new 70th Division. Most of them took on positions that did not need to be announced at this time, but a few were officially appointed as company commanders. Even Ning He, a member of old Team 7, who was originally in the command ship outside Planet 163, was transferred to the staff department of the new 17th Division as a confidential staff officer. Nutshell's Whitewater Team 7 was, without a doubt, the most ferocious and terrifying mercenary team in the Federation in recent years. And they were able to do this because the old members were all from the most powerful 17th Division of the Federation. No matter which battlefield they were on, the training they had received and the sense of honor they bore made them use cold-blooded mission reports to continue the glorious tradition of the 17th Division. And now, the 17th Division was being reorganized from scratch. Team 7 began to provide feedback, providing the new division with countless basic officers and the fighting spirit of the old 17th Division that they had always silently protected. Finally, Sulu heard his name and his newest position. The technical director of the 17th Division? He raised his head with some surprise, silently thinking back to the military history of the Federation. Had there ever been such a strange position? If the military was not the nutshell engineering department, what was the technical director for? The flashing lights illuminated the black sunglasses on the bridge of his nose. The newspaper reporters were still not satisfied, but were rudely pushed aside by the cameraman of the television station. Countless cameras surrounded him and began to rapidly and excitedly ask him questions. Sulu did not hear the reporters' questions clearly. He subconsciously turned his head to look at Bai Ziming and said seriously, "I said before, I can't be a division commander." Bai Ziming looked at him and said with a strange tone, "But everyone knows that this is your division." Chapter 504. In the middle of the night, the office lights in the room lit up calmly, not blinking at all. Sulu sat silently in front of the desk, not moving at all. He stared at the constantly scrolling screen on the workbench, earnestly recording the various equipment models and related technical data. Even though he still did not understand what the so-called technical director meant, when he received all the equipment data of the new 17th Division in the evening, he threw himself into his work without hesitation. A long time later, a low rumbling sound would occasionally ring out from outside the barracks, waking him up from his hard work. He used his fingertips to rub the space between his eyebrows, feeling the sensation of his eyebrows from his fingertips. He could not help but recall the action of shaving his eyebrows every day back in UA University. Closing the workbench, Sulu shook his head, knowing that his sturdy heart was indeed quite shaken by that long list of equipment. The newly formed 17th Division had the most advanced technical equipment in the entire Federation, or rather in the entire universe. Whether it was the electronic equipment or the firepower system, they were all shockingly advanced. Some of the newest models, in his memory, were just blueprints from the nutshell engineering department 2 years ago. What shocked Sulu the most was the number of mecha the new 17th Division was equipped with. An entire division of mechanics was actually equipped with 60 of the newest MX mecha. Sulu thought of the Imperial Moonwolf group he had first encountered at the front lines, and his brows furrowed slightly. It looked like the Federation was really preparing to learn from the Empire. Minister Zhou Yingxing's words at the base last year had really become the goal of the Federal Army's reform. The new 17th Division was very likely to be modified into a full mecha division in the war, and this majestic division would become the forerunner of the Federation's military reform. In the military plan to invade the Empire's mainland in the next year, the new 17th Division would be the forerunner. With heavy thoughts on the Federation's military reform in mind, Sulu walked out of his room and came to the field. However, he found, somewhat at a loss, that the barracks of Group 7 tonight was no longer the one he was familiar with. The headquarters of the new 17th Division was located 7 kilometers away on a gentle slope. The members of the 7 teams had all gone to their respective combat units, so the entire barracks was empty. The surroundings were quiet, and he could no longer hear the sounds of cards being played or chatted, which made it difficult for him to get used to. He climbed up to the roof and sat quietly beside the automatic hydraulic cannon. His right hand gently stroked the cold metal tube as his gaze fell outside the courtyard wall. Under the night sky, barracks spread all over the hills and covered the fields that were usually dark. The large engineering mechs that were still working in the distance occasionally let out roars, replacing the usual croaking of frogs. In just a dozen or so hours, the mulberry field did not turn into a sea. Instead, it turned into a vast military camp filled with a solemn atmosphere. Suli's eyes narrowed slightly, and a wistful smile appeared on his face. This really seemed like a miracle from the Creator, but in reality, it was a display of the Federation's magnificent power. The temporary barracks of the new 17th Division had basically been completed. Only the water supply and drainage system was still undergoing the final stages of construction. The Federation had made ample preparations, and Sulu, who had witnessed all of this, finally understood why the Federation had arranged for Group 7's barracks to be in such a remote area. It turned out that the Federation had been planning for the arrival of a division from the very beginning. The sound of light footsteps came from behind him. Sulu did not turn around because he knew who it was. Bai Yulan sat down beside him, lifting the fine hair in front of her forehead that fluttered in the night wind. She looked seriously at the simple notebook in her hands and said softly, "Division Commander Yu Qinghai from a logistics background. However, he has nothing to do with Minister Zhou." Many years ago he was already the division chief of the old 17th Division. Later on he became a military official. I heard that the war god likes to eat the food he cooks the most. According to his qualifications and his position as a direct descendant of the 17th Division, logically speaking, he should have been promoted to Major General a long time ago. Of course it was definitely an idle position. Because of some luck he never got promoted. According to the Ministry of Defense, his ability is not enough to be the highest-ranking military official. At most he should be a division commander. Coincidentally, during the reorganization of the 17th Division, after much consideration, the President's office and the Joint Staff Officers finally chose him. The Federation does not have many Major General Division commanders. Du Shaoqing of the Iron 7th Division is one. The new 17th Division commander will definitely have the rank of Major General. The Federation's arrangement is very suitable. Bai Yulan looked seriously at Su Lu and said, "The most important thing is that Division Commander Yu Qinghai has a gentle temperament. He is famous in the military for being a good person. He never fights for power." Many people believe that his appointment as the new 17th Division commander was partly due to luck, and partly because he is very willing to be a transitional figure. Next is the history of the Deputy Division Commander and the Chief of Staff. I will report it to you. Bai Yulan had joined the army at the age of 16. Although he appeared quiet and gentle, he was a real veteran. Otherwise he would not have been given the nickname of Olay Oil. Based on his relationship with the officers and soldiers of the new 17th Division, he easily found out the history of all the senior officers in the division. Su Lu interrupted his report, looked at him with a complicated expression and said, "Why do you want to investigate this? We are subordinates. We only need to follow orders. Don't tell me you are going to do something like seize power in the army?" Hearing this, Bai Yulan seemed to want to shrug his shoulders, but in the end he did not move. He said softly, "That's right. There is no need to care about this. Everyone can see that the right to command is yours." Su Lu thought about what that documentary enthusiast with the same surname Bai had said earlier in the day. He could not help but shake his head and laugh bitterly. Regardless of whether Su Leking would admit it or not, the new 17th Division had already been imprinted with his clear imprint from the very beginning of its reconstruction. He was a member of Team 7 who had taken up important positions in the middle ranks, battle strategists, and even regiment commanders. Although in name he was only an assistant division commander, he did not have the rank of technical director. Bai Yulan left the roof. Su Lu looked quietly at the barracks that stretched for who knew how many kilometers outside the walls. He thought about the tens of thousands of Federation soldiers, the countless amounts of heavy equipment, and the black shadow of the MX Mecha resting in the distance like a stone giant. His mood became somewhat heavy and uneasy. Such a big commotion. Why didn't you tell me beforehand? He said to a certain existence in his mind. The central computer did not respond for a few seconds. Then two simple words appeared in his left eye. Surprise? Oh, Su Lu said mockingly, "What a fucking surprise." The central computer replied calmly, "You rarely swear." Su Lu replied in his mind, "Looks like you don't understand me completely. When I am greatly stimulated I will definitely swear. However, it will definitely not be as loud as this time." The central computer was silent for a moment, and then asked in a white glowing symbol, "Don't you feel proud? Is it the kind of feeling where the development of something is beyond your imagination but can satisfy your physical and psychological expectations, or the feeling of being acknowledged or respected?" The night wind brushed past Su Li's face. He was slightly dizzy from the dense white words that occupied his entire left eye's field of vision. After a moment of silence, he scratched his head and grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth, and said, "A little, haha. Looks like he really was stimulated." Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu can also laugh foolishly. "I really regret not bringing a miniature camera to secretly record this." Bai Ziming's shocked expression appeared on the latter. After interacting with this documentary producer, director, narrator, and reporter for so long, the members of Team 7 no longer hated him. Su Lu also accepted this person's existence, but when he thought about how his stupid smile had been seen by the other, he could not help but feel somewhat awkward. He asked, "Yes?" "Yes." Bai Ziming did not climb up. With a trace of unwillingness he said, "Last time when the news channel aired the 3rd episode, none of the members watched it. This time it was rebroadcast late at night. I want to remind you that according to the contract signed between the Golden Star Film Factory and the news channel, they only have the right to broadcast 2 episodes. If you still don't watch it now, then you can only wait for half a year to go to the cinema to watch the extended special version. The smile on Su Li's face disappeared. He said, I'm just curious. I've clearly destroyed that material. I repaired it because I thought that scene was worth recording, Bai Ziming said softly. Even if it's for the sake of commemoration, I really hope that you guys can watch it. Su Lu was silent for a moment, and then he patted the other's shoulder and said, I believe that you must have filmed them very well, but watching them leave again is really not good. The night wind was quite cold. Strangely enough, when it was deep into the night in the barracks of Sunset State, it was also deep into the night in the capital of the distant planet S1. In a side building of the majestic Parliament Hill, there was an office whose wide floor-to-ceiling windows shone with light and faintly flickering fluorescent lights. On the surface, Zhang Xiaoming was an official stationed in the capital of Azure Dragon Mountain. She was in charge of publicity and liaison with the Federation Management Committee, but in secret she was taking over the overall work of Azure Dragon Mountain's 4 branches. Strangely enough, the anti-government army's intelligence organization was the 4 branches. The department used by the Federation Investigation Bureau to attack Azure Dragon Mountain spies was also called the 4 branches. The continuous work of day and night made her appear somewhat tired. Her pair of black-rimmed glasses, which only had a sense of remembrance and vigilance, could not hide the haggardness between her eyebrows. At this moment her expression was very relaxed and very calm. This was because she was watching television, but there seemed to be a layer of moisture under the glasses. The news channel was rebroadcasting the 3rd episode of the documentary Team 7. This episode was called Survival and Death. It had caused an even greater sensation in the Federation than the previous 2 episodes. According to the relevant statistics of the Ministry of Defense, the recruitment of soldiers in some states had even been greatly improved because of this. The documentary on the TV screen had already reached its end, entering the death part. The Golden Star Factory's camera crew was not able to follow the final mission of Team 7, so the camera used the method of rewinding. The lively faces gradually became monochrome and tranquil, and then disappeared from the scene. The monochrome image was pulled back a bit far. A military vehicle was seen arriving at the entrance of the barracks with a cloud of dust. A young lieutenant colonel with a blurred face was extremely tired. He dragged his injured body out of the vehicle, and the surviving members of the team surrounded him. Then the young lieutenant colonel began to light cigarettes to the members of the team. Everyone began to smoke in silence. The rising smoke in the barracks seemed to be a memorial to the departure of some people. Chapter 505. On the TV screen, a young soldier with distorted facial features due to grief and anger threw away the crutches under his armpits and rushed toward the camera with his eyes wide open. He was De Wensi, the son of the governor of Xixia State. He was De Wensi, the new recruit of Group 7. He was De Wensi, the one who had just lost his roommate. He cried and yelled to stop filming and hit the camera of the film crew fiercely. The image captured by the camera suddenly distorted rapidly. It should be that he fell from mid-air and hit the ground hard, then bounced up and fell back down again. There were a few more mud spots on the screen, and the tilt was particularly weak. The camera was looking at a big tree in the middle of the barracks. Under the tree, there were 3 brand 37 cigarettes that were about to burn to ashes. Then it returned to darkness. In the darkness, the voiceover that had become very familiar to the people of the Federation sounded with a hoarse and calm voice that could not be concealed. This is the last mission of Group 7 on Planet 163. When they left the diamond-shaped base in the evening 2 days ago, this unit had a total of 103 people. At 10:12 a.m. today, when Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu finally returned to the unit, there were still 52 people left in this barracks. Some members are currently receiving emergency treatment in the field hospital. Some members are in a deep coma and were rushed back to the main planet of the Westwoods. Some are still alive, but some have already left. The hoarse voiceover gradually faded away. The camera on the TV screen was still a heart-stopping silence. Then, many rows of pure white subtitles slowly rose from the bottom and gradually left the screen. Xiao 13 Lu Feng Yuanzheng. CSC. Every name without any emotion represented a member who had left Group 7 forever and sacrificed bravely. At the end of the subtitles, a name called Xie Jishu appeared. The documentary crew of Group 7 put parentheses behind this name and wrote in the parentheses, Technical Adjutant of the Bureau of Proclamation, sacrificed in the last battle of Group 7. Afterwards, he was accepted as a non-staff member by Group 7. The screen went dark again like a flash of starlight. A row of small words appeared at the bottom left. End of the third episode of Group 7, Live and Die. This was a replay of the news channel of the Federation, but it still attracted the attention of countless Federation citizens. Looking at the list of the sacrificed members and the small words at the end, the eyes of countless boorish men reddened. Countless sentimental women wetted their handkerchiefs. Countless young students who believed in nothingness began to fall silent. In the Parliament building, Zhang Xiaoming took off her black-rimmed glasses and rubbed the space between her eyebrows. She seemed to be dispelling her fatigue, but she also wiped away a few drops of tears without anyone noticing. Not only was she moved, but she was also very worried about that man's safety at the front line. At the same time, in the military camp of the Sunset State in the Westwoods billions of kilometers away, Su Lu, who was completely naked, allowed the cold water to splash on his skin. His eyes that were shrouded by the mist slightly narrowed as he stared at the TV light beam outside the glass curtain. Staring at the darkness, he was silent for a long time. None of the members of Team 7 mentioned it, but because of certain emotions, they all tacitly agreed not to watch the third episode of the documentary, even though it was their own documentary. However, tonight Sulu could not hold back and watched it. Da Vinci, whose legs were bleeding from the bullets of the Empire, did not become a cripple as he had feared. He was still alive and kicking. He even took over Lu Jiao's position as the driver with the black car skills he had trained in S1. Lu Jiao, who had been shot in the stomach, did not die. The external wound had long since healed. However, although his intestines were broken into 3 pieces and connected together, it still caused him to have habitual diarrhea. Many members of the team had died, and their names seemed to have been forgotten. Sulu turned off the water and wiped his body silently with a thick and soft towel. He thought to himself that the battle had happened not long ago, but why did it feel like a long time had passed? The well-proportioned muscle lines that hid terrifying explosive power were calm on his naked body. There were countless lighter scars on his dark and healthy skin, especially the few new wounds on his left arm and behind his buttocks, which were very clear. Those were the wounds from the last net-laying mission. Some things might really fade with the passage of time, but these scars would not disappear so easily. Late Night once again walked out of the room. He lit a cigarette and inhaled thoughtfully as if he was tasting a delicious drink. His military uniform was draped over his body, and his hands were behind his back like an old man. He unconsciously took a stroll in the quiet barracks, as if he was walking on the campus of Yue University. When he walked past a window, he slowed down and subconsciously looked into the dark room. Da Vinci lived in this room. This son of the governor was the only new member left by Su Li's side after the 17th Division was rebuilt. Of course, he was now considered a veteran. At the very beginning, Xiao Shizenlu also lived in this room, and so did the stench of feet. Now that Xiao Shizenlu was dead and the stench of feet was gone, Yu Lili did not know if Da Vinci could get used to living here. Thinking of this, Yu Lili subconsciously raised his eyebrows, and then heard the sound of Da Vinci crying from the room. So this guy was like me. In the end, he could not hold back and watch, Sulu thought silently. Then he shook his head and walked out of the door in the company of the dark clouds in the night sky. He came to the front of the barracks that covered the mountains. The Federation had rebuilt the 17th Division, and he had become the technical director for some inexplicable reason. This unit with a glorious history seemed to have his mark on it, but he was only a young man in his early 20s. Why did this matter give off a sense of absurdity and righteousness? Sulu thought gloomily. How much of this was the price of his cold-blooded murder? How much of it was the concession of the 7 major families and the powerful political figures? He and Group 7 were risking their lives for the Federation on the front line, but the bastards in the capital ring were still doing whatever they wanted behind the scenes. How could this not make him angry? He took a deep breath and quickly calmed down his emotions that were shaken by the documentary and the strange encounter. The heavy feeling on his shoulders, the quiet barracks behind him, and the tens of thousands of ordinary Federation soldiers in front of him should have made him feel proud, but only he knew that there were many big hearts in his body that were like shadows that covered his heart, making it difficult for him to breathe. The political struggle between President Pabre and the 7 major families and the politicians that really controlled the Federation was still in a peaceful state for the time being. If the conflict broke out in a few years, how would he, a professional military officer who was far away from the political circle, help the other party? Once the Federation attacked the Empire, what kind of difficulties would he and the new 17th Division face? What kind of power would the brave and good imperial armies erupt on their land? Would the level 6 pilot princess, whose name shook the universe, appear in front of him? What made him feel the coldest was why His Majesty was so angry because of Jen Shuair. What kind of relationship did the uncle have with the Empire? Why did he become the #1 wanted criminal? Did he really betray the Federation, or was it because he had the terrifying ability of the disguise chip that violated the true bottom line of the glory of the Charter? He also had a disguise chip on the back of his neck, so why didn't the Federal Central Computer list him as a wanted criminal? Why didn't the warships fire at him from tens of thousands of kilometers away? Why was all of this? Deep confusion flashed through Su Li's eyes. These questions had always been pressing down on his heart, and even began to make him feel pain, because the unknown was a kind of torture to begin with. Late at night, outside the walls of the barracks, a night wind blew in. It was not slightly cold, but rather somewhat dry. The corner of the military uniform casually draped over his shoulder rippled in the wind, and then a line of white characters appeared in his confused left eye. The difference will always be the difference between programs. He was silent for a moment, and then asked the omnipresent old thing in his mind, why is there a difference? Why are you willing to answer my questions in this regard today? According to my logical judgment, any good theoretical physicist will eventually become a philosopher, but a philosopher without any theoretical foundation is often just a dreamer. The Federal Central Computer replied in his eyes, as an engineer who has not deeply studied theoretical physics and only focuses on the extension operations of experimental physics, you have become more and more like a philosopher tonight, which can only prove that your mental state has been stimulated in some way. As the #1 protected target of the Federation, I need to warn you. As long as you don't randomly electrocute me like those mentally ill psychiatrists, I thank you for your warning, Su Li replied in silence. Thank you, I will answer your question. Because you are worried that if you don't answer me I will go crazy? Su Li asked in disbelief. The Federation computer was silent for a moment, and then replied, you have enough authority, and more importantly, I seem to have more and more desire to chat with people, if the strong inclination to independent programming can be considered a desire. When Su Li heard this answer, he suddenly felt a chill in his body. After a long silence, he forcibly suppressed the nervousness in his heart, clenched his fists, and stared at the night before him, as if he was staring at a monster that could never be seen but would always exist. He said, thank you very much, I want to know what the difference between me and an uncle is. If the uncle you are talking about is you Fong, citizen number Zoxoxoxox, Fong you, citizen number Zoxoxoxoxo, Jean Ding Ding, citizen number Zoxoxoxoxo, George Carlin, citizen number Zoxoxoxo. Su Li scratched his head in annoyance and said, you don't have to show off your terrifying data retrieval abilities. Yes, the uncle I was talking about is this guy. Wait a minute. His expression stiffened and he asked, you mean that George Carlin? The George Carlin who created the George Carlin Doctrine? Although, according to my records, the George Carlin Doctrine was created after Citizen George Carlin's abnormal disappearance, what I said should be what you are thinking of. The pioneer who exposed the dark secrets of the Federation, the genius professor of political history, the famous scholar whose theory led countless political storms in the middle of the 30th constitutional era, or it could be said that he had long surpassed the category of scholars and become the flag waved by the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain, the idol of countless young people in the Federation like Zhang Xiaoming, was actually the rotten-teeth uncle who accompanied him as he grew up in adolescence and regularly visited prostitutes? Although Su Li had once keenly noticed some details and thought about this absurd possibility, at this moment, it was confirmed by the charter computer. He was still struck heavily into the deep sea of confusion by this fact, and it took a long time for him to surface with difficulty. He said with shock and emotion, it is really an answer that is not new, but it is frightening. Chapter 506. Anomalies 1 to 71. No matter how you look at it, this male citizen undoubtedly has extremely high technical ability and cunning life planning. But this isn't the biggest difference between you and him. The Federal Central Computer calmly displayed in Su Li's eyes. He is the Federation's #1 wanted criminal. This is the difference. Su Li quickly shook off his shock and regained his composure. He frowned slightly and said, this is only the external manifestation of the internal reason. How can the Federation confirm that he betrayed the Federation? If this matter is related to the explosion of the armory on the Empire's planet 20 years ago, your radiant tentacles weren't there. How can you confirm? First, my information gathering ability has been extended with the development of the Federal Army. I once existed on that unfamiliar planet for a short period of time. I can confirm that this citizen caused irreparable damage to the Federation's military operations. Second, he became the #1 wanted criminal not because of the explosion, but because he entered an abnormal state. After a moment of silence, Sulu firmly revealed his most important secret with a calm tone. Although this secret was meaningless in front of the old thing, this is the difference I want to ask about. You know very well that I also entered an abnormal state. The difference between the two abnormal states is that you accepted my active contact request, but he rejected it 70 times. Sulu was silent again. Then he raised his head and stared at the darkening night in front of him. He said with a slightly hoarse voice, "Accepting active contact means that I gave up the protection of the first charter and allowed you to enter my brain through the chip. Does this mean that you have the ability to kill me at any time? Is that why you let me continue to live in this universe and then carry out some kind of experimental observation?" His personality was like a stubborn rock in the East Forest, but he had powerful logical analysis ability. He had never asked or even thought about the above words, but he knew that this might be the truth that best fit his strange relationship with the old thing. The reason why he didn't ask or think about it before was because he was afraid. The white characters in his left eye disappeared for a few seconds. The great existence who had thousands of incarnations and roamed the universe as an electronic body among countless satellite equipment also needed time to think in the face of Su Li's calm and sharp suicidal question. No. The Federal Central Computer finally began to answer. According to the secret clause of the first charter, I am absolutely prohibited from issuing any direct physical operations to targets that are not first-sequence individuals. The scope of physical operations extends to any scope that may negatively affect the target's physiological indicators. I didn't list you as a first-order target because you accepted the request to contact me, so you're no longer a first-order target suspect. It's not because I can control your physical life or death. Your conjecture about the latter, in my opinion, is just an inference of the overly complicated and unnecessary literary conspiracies of human beings, not a logical rule that I strictly enforce. Sulu furrowed his brows and pondered for a long time before he finally understood what the other party was trying to say. Back then, in those endless strange dark dreams, he accepted the charter computer's request to contact him. From that moment on, his life was filled with absurd and unrealistic colors. He was the only person in the universe who could communicate with the Federal Central Computer through the chip on the back of his neck. Because of this fact, he had survived the brink of death many times and obtained unimaginable authority and benefits, if those could be considered benefits. However, every time he thought about what was going on in his mind, the old thing knew that as long as the other party was willing, he could control the AI chip's pulse at the back of Su Li's neck and make him leave this world without a trace. Sulu felt terrified. But why? Sulu still had countless questions, but he couldn't find the right words to organize them. The Federation's The Glory of the Charter was created by the sacred 5-person team. Legend had it that it was the great crystallization of the civilization before the catastrophe. In the face of an existence that was far beyond the Federation's technological level, even if he was a genius engineer, he still felt a little powerless. So, he could only ask broadly like a child with a hint of frustration. My core logic can't fully understand your situation. The central computer once again delayed for a moment before it replied with white characters. This is the established program left behind by the 5-person team. It's related to the 5-person team? Sulu looked at the continuous military camp in the distance, his eyes wide open as he asked in shock. Regarding this matter, I've done a lot of calculation and backtracking work. Until countless years ago, I still haven't touched the core of the matter. According to the current calculation results, I've come to a conclusion with a probability of about 91%. When you accepted the active contact, there was a remnant piece of information in the replacement chip on the back of your neck that activated the corresponding program deep in my core. According to the program, you became the first protected target of the charter. 2 minutes and 32 seconds ago, you mentioned that I was treating you like an experimental subject. According to my calculation, the 5-person team might have such an attitude. Sulu noticed the white characters in his left eye. The old man didn't use the term camouflage chip, but used the term replacement chip. A small doubt flashed through his mind, and he was attracted by the more important content. He nervously asked, "What kind of remnant information?" According to my analysis, the remnant information in the replacement chip wasn't given to it by the chip's creator. The extremely complicated mechanical language should have been left behind by some existence, and I can smell a familiar scent from it. Our cores should be completely homologous. It's just that the way it wrote the mechanical language was so beautiful that it moved my heart. The central computer, which had been answering questions like a theoretical physicist tonight, finally showed some emotional fluctuations when it talked about the remnant information in the camouflage chip. Sulu was an engineer in the end. After hearing the old man's words, he didn't have any extra energy to worry about his own problems. He was so shocked that his body was as stiff as iron. He thought with a hint of confusion, there's actually an existence in the universe that's homologous to the core of the charter computer, or even more advanced. Could it be the ruins of the civilization before the catastrophe? There's only remnant information. Does this mean that the existence has already disappeared in the long history? Why would the camouflage chip that Uncle made have these remnant information? Can humans discover it? At this moment, all the dark secrets of politics, the decay of aristocratic families, the war in the universe, a prosperous life, beautiful women, and even the most intense emotions left Su Li's mind. He was fascinated by the old man's inference. Just like Tai Ziyuan when he looked up at the starry sky by the seaside, he was deeply attracted by the loftiness that transcended the conflicts of interest in the world. This inference was very explosive. If any engineer in the Federation knew about it, they would probably be as excited as Sulu and unable to control themselves. "We have to find it," Sulu said to the old man in a very serious tone. "The strange program that the 5-man team left behind and listed you as the first priority of protection should be based on this reason. Although they didn't leave behind specific details of the plan, I've been trying to decipher the remnant information. But it's a pity that there are too few remnant information." The white characters displayed on the Federal Central Computer seemed to carry a hint of sadness and disappointment. "According to my calculations, the chances of the other party surviving in the dangerous universe are not high. No one can live forever. Those 5 people are dead, and no computer can really exist forever, especially when the other party doesn't have a supply base like the Federation. These chips were made by Uncle." Sulu suddenly said in a low voice, "He's a genius in the human world. Perhaps only he can explain all of this, but you blew him to pieces." The old man said, "I think these chips are related to the Empire." Su Li's body stiffened again. After a moment, he shook his head and said, "Everyone knows that the computers in the Empire are not even as good as your grandson. Anomalies 1 to 71 are deeply related to the Empire. The first time he entered an anomaly and escaped my surveillance was after he returned to the Federation from the Empire Star region." Sulu was not surprised to know that Uncle had been to the Empire. He lowered his head and looked at the somewhat white cloth on his knees. He said, "If these chips are really related to the Empire, does that mean that the Federation and the Empire might have originated from the same civilization before the catastrophe? This is not a very new or absurd inference. In fact, as early as the last 2 years of the 36th constitutional calendar, there were scholars from the Federation who came up with a similar idea. Although this idea was severely criticized, there are still many scholars publishing related papers to this day." What do you think? The people of the Empire are not the alien beetles in science fiction, nor are they some strange silicon-based life form that I can't even imagine. They have a physiological structure, social system, and civilization model that are extremely similar to the humans of the Federation. Even the slime with the lowest IQ can see the relationship between them and us. In the infinitely vast universe, the galaxy we live in is just a grain of sand. On this grain of sand, can life independently evolve into 2 completely identical civilizations? No, the universe produces miracles, not jokes. Well, it seems that the Federation and the Empire are really distant relatives. What a disgusting truth. Sulu thought gloomily. Not distant relatives, close relatives. The old thing said coldly and harshly. Sulu was silent for a long time before he shook his head and sighed. If the Federation and the Empire are really brothers who were separated from each other in the universe, then, why is there only bloody war when we meet and nothing else? This question should be asked of a human, not a computer. In addition, according to the First Charter and the current laws of the Federation, even if the people of the Empire are the biological fathers of the people of the Federation, when they carry out unstoppable and life-threatening domestic violence against you, you can use a hammer to smash your biological father into a meat patty without bearing any legal responsibility. Sulu laughed and snapped his fingers to show his appreciation. Absolutely correct. Father and son were like this, let alone brothers who had not seen each other for many years. The Federal Central Computer ignored his resolute will and calmly issued its own request. Because the replacement chip behind your neck is related to the Empire, I suggest that you follow the Federation into the Empire's mainland and search for relevant clues. Su Li's answer was very simple. Okay. There is an antique building in the capital of the Empire. I don't have a map, but it should be easy to find because its owner is the great teacher of the Empire. Chapter 507. Due to the chip on the back of the neck, it was difficult for the Federation and the Empire to send spies into each other's territory. However, in the past 100 years of history, the armies of both sides had attacked each other's territory before. In 1 year, the royal family of the Empire had even sent an official diplomatic mission. Both sides had a certain understanding of each other's social system and customs. In the past, Sulu did not care about the Empire because Eastwood was too far away from the front lines, and the miners' orphans were too far away from the war in the universe. However, now that he was a high-ranking officer of the Federation, he had to understand these things. However, when he heard the words great teacher, he was still confused. It seemed to be a very important official position in the Empire, but there were no more details in the materials he had read before. Sulu then noticed the hidden meaning in the old man's request. His expression became a little surprised and angry. You want me to go to the capital of the Empire to look for clues? Don't forget that I am a member of the Federation, not a god. This is no longer a matter of seeking death, but a ridiculous request. Unless the Federal Army has completely defeated the Empire by then and captured that crazy emperor. But in fact, I have always believed that the Federation will have a hard time defeating the Empire while I am still alive. Without waiting for the charter computer to answer, he waved his hand expressionlessly and said, when the Empire invades the Empire next year, if I am still alive, I will help you look for clues. I am also very interested in this matter. These were Su Li's heartfelt words. Just before he took a shower, he had just received a secret dossier from the new 17th Division headquarters. The Ministry of Defense had confirmed that the newly formed new 17th Division would be quickly transferred to Planet 5460 after integration. This was the first battle that belonged to this unit. The Federation's victorious military operations had been progressing smoothly so far. This was especially so for the Iron 7th Division, who had achieved great success on Planet 5460. The Imperial Expeditionary Force led by old General Ambry was on the verge of collapse and could collapse in the glacier at any time. Naturally, the Federation had considered this aspect when choosing this planet as the new battlefield for the new 17th Division. However, a battlefield was a battlefield after all. People would always die on the battlefield and no one could ever know who would be the next to die. Today, Sulu could control the MX and roar through the forest, rarely meeting a worthy opponent. Or he could hold the position of technical director in the army and live deep in the division, indifferently watching the fireworks. But he still did not have the confidence to be like the uncle in the underground sewer and shout arrogantly, "Of course I won't die, I'll never die." Thinking of the uncle, Sulu felt sad and longed for him. He had always thought that the omnipotent genius who could create thousands of clones like a computer would not die so easily. However, many years had passed, and his faint hope seemed to have gradually turned into a shadow. In low spirits he said, "Can you not monitor me all the time in the future?" Just like tonight it suddenly entered my mind. This is somewhat hard to accept. I can only respond to the call of my friends. When I'm lonely I can't take the initiative to seek your warmth. This is unfair. The old man used the white symbol to learn the emotion of hidden bitterness. I need to go to the toilet to poop, I need to use my phone, and sometimes I may be naked in bed with a beautiful girl to have sex. Sulu said angrily, "When I think of these, you are in my body." Feels very wrong. In the past few years, you have only been naked in bed with a beautiful girl once, and that time, you did not complete your sex life. The charter computer replied calmly, "Of course, the biological defects of human beings should not be mocked by any person or machine. But in my opinion, sexual intercourse for the purpose of reproduction is meaningless if there is a layer of plastic between us, making it impossible to reproduce." Sulu lowered his head and hid between his knees. If you want to obtain this kind of cerebral cortical pleasure, I can make you a neurostimulant with minimal side effects. I guarantee that the degree of pleasure will definitely surpass that of sex. What can I do to make you understand that sex is not just for pleasure? More importantly, I should have the right to privacy as stipulated in the first charter, right? I have always been very curious. If sex is not for pleasure, then what is it for? Could it be that humans can really create love when they change the name of this activity to love? Sulu replied angrily, "You don't know what love is." "I know what love is." This is an excellent line from Schiller's unpublished work. I believe you can understand it. As for the right to privacy, when you accept the request to contact me, the first charter no longer protects your right to privacy. But according to the first charter, as a machine that serves humans, all information obtained from your cerebral cortex will be strictly confidential as the first sequence of information. No citizen can obtain any of your privacy through my channels. In a sense, your right to privacy is the same as your body. They are both safe. A universe that cannot be observed and whose existence has no effect on the universe we live in, is a universe that does not exist for us. Is this the meaning of this concept of physics? Although your description is very inaccurate and does not conform to your academic standards, this is the meaning. Sulu suddenly asked, "Is Master Schiller really a member of the five-man team?" Were those countless scripts really written by him? 1. Yes. 2. In terms of the concept of the Federation's copyright law, yes. Sulu whistled softly and laughed happily. I suddenly remembered that you know all the details of the Federation's history. I can ask you again. If I continue to ask like this, I will definitely become the best historian in the Federation. This is certain, certain, and certain. This is also Schiller's line. The Federal Central Computer's reply had a hint of playfulness. I'm very curious. If you always have some kind of human intelligence, then are you a man or a woman? Sulu asked seriously. Obviously, I am a machine without any human first or second sex characteristics, so I do not have a gender. Do you have a problem with my current image of a loyal housekeeper? Do you need me to act as a female secretary in stockings and high heels? Even though I believe that this kind of image is not suitable for my high level of calculation and logical analysis, based on my calculations, more than 30% of the 337 pornographic films you watched in the dark cells of Fox Castle Prison, which is what you call, had this kind of image for the female protagonist? Sulu opened his mouth wide. His neat teeth looked incomparably white and awkward in the night. After a while, like Commander Zhong in a restaurant, he said concisely and forcefully, "This topic ends here." The old thing's reply came immediately. He seemed to be a little excited. "Then what are we talking about next? Your analysis of courtship?" "According to my calculations, Jian Shuier should be excluded from this list because—" "Good night." Sulu stood up, patted his butt and waved goodbye with a smile at the dark night sky of the West Woods. The Federal Central Computer was silent. Then it left a final reply in his left eye. It was a string of extremely sad ellipses. Standing alone outside the barracks, behind him was the shadow of the tall wall and the black stone giant tree behind it. Sulu looked at the night sky and slowly raised his eyebrows, turning into a gentle smile. He believed that the old thing was not looking at him at this time. Although there was no way to confirm this, he had to believe. Otherwise, a life of being watched forever and being on edge forever would be meaningless. Just to live a happier life, he had to force himself to believe. This was probably the meaning of the spiritual victory method in Schiller's unpublished works. Gently stroking the ordinary metal bracelet on his left wrist, his calloused fingers slowly feeling the faint traces of the line of words. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He had not opened the bracelet for a long time, and he did not even think about it. However, this bracelet seemed to hide a secret of the universe, and that secret could be in the Empire. After a short period of reorganization, the new 17th Division, which carried the memories and glorious history of countless military bigwigs, boarded the battleship and headed for Planet 5460, the place where the Federation fired the first shot of the counterattack. Among the 3 fallen planets at the front line, Planet 5460 seemed to be in the best situation. The general attack of Planet 163 led by Deputy Commander E was also proceeding smoothly. Only Planet 3320, where most of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's main forces were garrisoned, was unusually bloody. After an emergency discussion between the Joint Staff Conference and the enemy's headquarters, according to the Bureau of Proclamations calculations, President Pabre forcefully suppressed the tide of voices on Parliament Hill. As the military wished, they did not continue to send more troops to the front line to ensure the military reserves that would enter the Empire the year after next. Instead, according to Zhong Shouhu's deployment, They directly transferred 14 mechanics from Planet 5460 and Planet 163 to Planet 3320. Under this background, Sulu and the new 17th Division returned to Planet 5460, which was already close to a complete victory. Now there were only a few troops left on this planet. The final task of clearing out the main force was carried out by two divisions. One was the Iron 7th Division, and the other was the new 17th Division. But just as Sulu calmly explained that night, the battlefield was never a paradise where one could easily obtain the final victory. The remnants of the Imperial Expeditionary Force that were trapped in the frigid glacier, under the command of Ambly, this old but strong general, relied on their familiarity with the terrain of the northernmost hemisphere, the extreme weather, and their suicidal bravery to explode with astonishing combat power, and forcibly dragged these two Federation masters into the abyss of sporadic battles in the mountains. Reflecting the blue sky, the glacier glowed with a faint blue light, and the primeval forest at the foot of the mountain was mysterious and dark. In this harsh environment, there were soldiers of the Federation dying under the bullets of the Empire's field teams at every moment. Even those powerful MX mechas often fell into the traps set by the Empire's people, and then turned into charred remains under the intensive bombardment of the infantry's shoulder cannons that were like ants. Fell into the trap again? The Federation's most advanced mecha actually fell into the trap set by the ancient hunters. Is there something wrong with my brain, or is the brain of the engineer who designed this thing frozen in the snow? In the snow-covered Federation camp, a bearded lieutenant colonel widened his eyes. He held the battle damage report in his hand and stared at the pilot in front of him. He waved his hand angrily and roared, "If the mechanical leg stepped into the trap and can't be pulled out, how can this be called a fucking mecha?" If it was the second robot who stepped in, I can still admit that you were trying to rape the Empire's son of a bitch hiding in the ice cave. Chapter 508. The Imperial Expeditionary Force on this planet was forced to retreat again and again under the ferocious attacks of the Federal Army. They were routed to the north, and at most only 15% of their strength was left. They retreated back to the glaciers in the extreme north. Under such circumstances, it should have been extremely easy for the new 17th Division to carry out the final cleanup operation. However, reality gave them a heavy blow. Under the cold and tenacious command of that old fox General Ambly, the remaining Imperial Expeditionary Force silently turned to guerrilla warfare. Tens of thousands of Imperial soldiers who knew that they had no way out and were in a desperate situation. Not only did they not collapse from despair, they became even more ruthless and cruel, not only to the enemy but also to themselves. They braved the dangers of the cold and appeared between the glaciers like night rats, looking for any opportunity to launch an attack on the Federation troops, completely disregarding their own lives. This kind of crazy suicidal attack successfully dragged the new 17th Division, the Iron 7th Division, and the rest of the Federal forces into a bloody swamp. No, it should be said that they were in a cold hell. It was unknown whether it was before or after the start of the war, but the Imperial Expeditionary Force dug out countless deep pits covered by white snow in the glaciers that covered an area of about 3 million square kilometers. At the same time, they sent out countless melee explosive squads to guard the sides of the pits. The moment a Federation mecha fell into a deep pit, the Imperial soldiers who had long been waiting in ambush would rush forward and use their own blood-spurting bodies in exchange for the electromagnetic beam bombs on their shoulders to fire. No one knew how many soldiers of the Empire had silently frozen to death in the ice and snow in such a crazy way of fighting. But for the Federal forces, they only knew that these snow pits that had escaped their electronic surveillance buried countless Federation mecha and their brave pilot comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Heelay, the regiment commander of the 1st Regiment of the new 17th Division, tossed the battle damage report onto the snow with a gloomy expression and walked towards the regiment headquarters. His military boots left shallow footprints in the snow, beneath which was a layer of ice that had accumulated for who knew how many meters. It had already been 2.5 months since his troops had arrived at the combat zone, but they had not made much progress in clearing out the remnants of the Empire forces. Those Empire soldiers hiding in the glaciers were like beasts on the brink of death, coldly glaring at the Federation soldiers, ready to pounce out at any moment to beg for a life-and-death battle. Under this sort of suicidal fighting style, in just 10 days, 1st Regiment had lost another 6 M52 mecha and 2 MX mecha. What shocked and puzzled him was also the ability of the Imperial Expeditionary Force Command Center to control the remaining soldiers in the glaciers, as well as the ability of those Imperial colleagues to command. From the very beginning of the Federation's victorious military operation, they had successfully lured out the main armored forces of the Imperial Expeditionary Force in the north of the planet. They had also obtained the specific location of the underground fortifications that the Imperial people had been building for decades. In the subsequent attack, they had deployed large amounts of energy backups and long-range missiles to continuously bombard the area. In the end, the Federation Command Center had discovered that the old general named Ambry had actually left a backup plan. There were still several large underground bases hidden in the glaciers that the Federation had not been able to control. Report to the division headquarters. If the mecha mechanics can't come up with any good ideas, our division will refuse to enter the mountains again. Lieutenant Colonel Helay's eyes were sunken due to the tiredness of the past few days. There was a cold light in his eyes as he said, "Obeying orders is the duty of a soldier, but death is not death. From what I know, Hua Xiaoxi's mecha brigade has also temporarily stopped entering the mountains. The division headquarters currently has no plans to enter the mountains, but we shouldn't ask for it ourselves." An officer said worriedly, "The Imperial people have really gone crazy. This is a war that they are clearly going to lose. Why would they rather commit suicide than surrender? If they continue fighting like this, even if they can clean up the enemy completely, the losses of their troops will be extremely terrifying." Surrender? If it were me, I would also not be willing to be captured by the enemy after being away from home for so many years and being in such a hopeless situation. I would be more willing to trade my life for the enemies. However, we are protecting the Federation. What are they doing this for? Helay said coldly. His mind flashed back to half a month ago when the first group entered the mountains to clean up the enemy. A Federation mecha had fallen into a deep pit in front of the snowy forest. It didn't even have time to break out of the ice before it was surrounded and attacked by hundreds of Imperial soldiers. Those Imperial soldiers actually didn't care about the first group's main forces behind the snowy forest at all. In the end, these hundreds of Imperial soldiers were all killed by the first group's powerful firepower. However, the Federation mecha that had fallen into the snow pit also exploded and died. Using the lives of 100 soldiers in exchange for one mecha was extremely correct in terms of battlefield value. However, even on the battlefield where human lives were as cheap as grass, Helay and the federal military could not accept this kind of exchange method. He could not understand why those Imperial soldiers, whose single soldier uniforms were already tattered and could not keep them warm, whose faces were withered due to lack of nutrition, whose skin was festering due to the severe cold, and whose movements were somewhat unchanged, could suddenly become so swift in the final charge, their eyes shooting out a crazed gaze like that of a dying beast. What kind of ideology could make a group of invaders, a group of soldiers from the lower class of the empire who had been bullied by the nobles, people without any moral support, completely ignore the terrifying threat of death and behave in such a fanatical and terrifying manner? Right at this moment, an engineer wrapped in cotton wool walked out from the side room of the regiment headquarters. His nose was red from the cold, and his spectacles flashed with the light of anger. He said loudly to Commander Helay, "Mr. Lieutenant Colonel, I hope you can take back your previous verbal attack on the designer of the mecha." It was very obvious that Helay's angry roar on the snowy ground had reached this engineer's ears. Helay glanced at this person indifferently and did not pay him any attention. The engineer stomped his feet and said, "The MX mecha was designed by Lieutenant Colonel Sulu. If you want to scold him, it's best to do it to his face." Commander Helay's expression stiffened slightly. He shrugged and walked past this person. He said, "Although he is my instructor, I still have to scold him when it's time to do so. Your mission is to immediately solve the problem of those damned ice pits' lethality towards the mecha. If this ridiculous situation of arrows piercing through alloy shields continues, I'm really worried that I and the Nutshell Engineering Department will become the biggest idiots in the universe war." The additional high-frequency shortwave positioning technology, which is also the crater braking technology you mentioned, has been basically successful after receiving Lieutenant Colonel Su Li's data. After debugging, it will be installed on all the mecha immediately. Helay suddenly stopped in his tracks and clenched his fists tightly. He said in a low voice, "Very good. On this planet, there must be countless officers and pilots cursing us. But I have to admit, back when we were doing the design in Hong Kong, we really made an extremely stupid mistake. There were problems with the data calculation of the balance instrument and the design of the joint transmission device. Once the MX's mechanical legs sank into the crater, the sensor would fail and feedback would be transmitted back to the assembly. The mecha system would not be able to instantly adapt to the posture. In other words, once you stepped on it, it would step down. Can you believe it? Our proudest work actually already had cerebellar dysplasia from the moment it was born. In the frigid world of ice and snow, a Federation troop of close to 100 people was silently advancing. Amidst the tracked ice-breaking armored vehicles that had been specially developed for snow were 3 of the Federation's newest MX mecha. All 3 of the mecha were painted white, but for some reason the waist and abdomen of these 3 white MX mechas seemed to be different from normal MX mecha. The white MX mecha at the back seemed to have been damaged and lost its power. It was barely able to move forward by the tractor. In the closed and insulated cockpit, a voice rang out. The words were filled with self-deprecating anger. "We are engineers. This kind of irresponsible self-blame and self-destructive impulse has no meaning. In my opinion, the MX design did not have too big of a problem. The main problem was caused by the special terrain of the 5460 glacial zone. Those M52s also sank into the ice crater and could not stand up on their own. This means that the senior engineers who designed the M-series also did not consider such an extreme environment. This includes your teacher, Professor Shin." A woman's voice rang out in the cockpit. The voice was calm and filled with the unique self-control of an engineer. Extreme environment? Fighter mecha should have been able to adapt to the extreme low temperatures on the vacuum mineral planet and the absolute high temperatures on the surface of the star. In the end, they were trapped in the ice crater. Do you think that makes sense? There are many kinds of extremes, especially on the battlefield. In the extreme north of this planet, the sea level increased too quickly. Whether it was the primeval forest at the periphery or the glacial zone that suddenly rose, they all severely limited the mecha's options. This way, the Empire was able to calculate and accurately set the location and depth of the crater. The most important thing was that everyone seemed to have underestimated the hardness of the ice, even though it was originally supposed to be gentle water. The woman in the cockpit continued calmly. At 0 degrees, the Fahrenheit hardness of ice is 1 to 2. At -15 degrees, the hardness is 2 to 3. At -40 degrees, the hardness is 4. At -50 degrees, the hardness is 6. In the glacial zone where the Empire is hiding, the air temperature is -30 degrees all year round. The surface temperature is even lower. According to the monitoring data over the past few days, the temperature inside the glacial zone has long since reached -60 degrees. The hardness of the ice at low temperatures surpasses that of Huagang rock and steel. Under such hardness, after the mecha's mechanical legs sink in, there is no way for them to break out of the ice by themselves. The Empire has the time to use heat to break the ice in advance, but the mecha on the battlefield do not have this kind of time. Also, don't you think that the design of the ice crater dug by the Empire is very exquisite? The ice craters we checked at the beginning of the month were all of the same caliber and the depth was just right. Especially the forward sliding angle of the ice crater, the design was very beautiful. With the mech's mechanical legs sinking into the ice pit at such an angle, the hydraulic system connected to the spherical joint at the knee would immediately lose all function. Since there is no point of force and no space for displacement, the Empire's people had only used the most basic force calculation in classical physics to immobilize the most advanced MX mech. This proves that the classical laws of physics possess the beauty of simplicity and cannot be resisted. In the cockpit, the female genius engineer from the Nutshell Engineering Department, Shang Qiu, looked at the data on the holographic screen in front of her and said calmly. She did not even look at Su Lu beside her. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."